The WHITBY Witches by Robin Jarvis, read by Julia McKenzie. Mrs. Roddice perched herself on the edge of her Spartan desk and sucked her watery afternoon tea through sullen lips. She was relieved, for 2 of her more trying charges had left today. She had put them on the train personally. Margaret Roddice ran a hostel for children, those whose parents were dead, indifferent, or inside. But now that creepy little boy had gone, and she hoped things would get back to normal. Of course I was right to send that letter, she reassured herself. Even if the old bat does know someone on the board, she had to be aware of what she was letting herself in for. Mrs. Roddice shook her head at the folly of the old woman in question. At her age, I ask you, she addressed the table lamp. Well, it won't last. It never does with them. A thin smile twitched her mouth. Still, she muttered, whatever happens, they're not coming back here. The train slowed and pulled into Middlesbrough. Ben twisted on his seat, his eyes following the people who got off. He was 8 years old, a serious-looking boy with mousy hair and eyes which were set unusually deep below his frowning brows. His sister, Jennet, had the same oval face and unremarkable blobby nose, but her long waving hair was darker, and her eyes were less troubled. "We're nearly there?" he asked suddenly. "I don't think it's far now," she answered. Ben abandoned the delights of the window and faced his sister. With one of his disconcerting stares, he asked her soberly, "Jen, what do you think it will be like this time? Will we be there long?" The girl shrugged. "Miss Boston's old. That's all I could get out of the Roddice." At the mention of the name, Ben screwed up his face. "I hated her," he said passionately. "I'm glad we're not there now. She used to frighten me." "Not as much as you used to frighten her," remarked his sister dryly. "Listen, remember what I said." A warning note crept into her voice. "You're not to talk of that with this one, right?" Ben nodded and hastened to change the subject. "Will we really live near the sea, Jen?" "Well, yes, I think I heard Roddice say Whitby was on the coast. It's the end of the line, anyway." A year before, Jennet would have been nervous and excited at the prospect of moving to somewhere new, but that was 4 different foster homes ago. The first she had heard of this Miss Boston had been 2 weeks ago, but presumably negotiations had been going on long before that. Jennet was curious. Why would an old woman go out of her way to foster 2 children she had never even seen? And why would the authorities let her? If only the Roddice had said more. The railway track became a single line. Just how far away was Whitby? It seemed as though they were going beyond the reaches of the civilized world. "Look," said Ben excitedly. "There's a river, and there's a boat, see?" A ribbon of water ran parallel to the track. For some moments it was obscured by dense trees, then was revealed once more wider than before. Buildings clustered on the far bank, and the river swelled into a marina with yachts. Jennet caught a glimpse of a high cliff. Then the vision was snatched from view, and the train, wheezing with exhaustion, finally drew into Whitby station. "I can't see anyone," said Jennet, looking up the platform. "Come on, maybe she's waiting for us outside." They trudged up to the barrier, and Jennet began to rummage in her pockets for the tickets. "Has it arrived, George?" came a brisk female voice. The ticket collector turned and nodded to the newcomer. "Aye, 3 minutes early, Miss Boston." Jennet looked up sharply. There, with her hands clasped firmly behind her back, stood a stout, white-haired woman. She wore a jacket of sage-green tweed with a matching skirt, and on her head sat a shapeless velvet hat. The cobweb lines around her grey, bird-like eyes suggested the old lady's age to be about 70, but her stance was like someone much younger. The old woman saw the children, and her face lit up. The eyes blinked and disappeared, and the rolls of skin beneath the chin shook like jelly. "Oh, these must be mine," she cried, clapping her hands together like an eager child. "Yours, Miss Boston?" asked the ticket collector, baffled.
Yes, yes, George. Now let them through that wretched thing. But they ain't given me their tickets. Oh, stuff! She exclaimed in exasperation. Let them through at once. They're with me. And she stamped her foot and gave the man a look which no one would have dared disobey. Miss Boston clucked gleefully as she ran her keen eyes over Jennet and Ben. "Let me have a good look at you," she demanded. "So you're Jennet. Now, I believe that you are 12. Is that correct?"
"Yes."
You look older. Act it, too. Not surprising, really."
Miss Boston nodded as though satisfied with the girl and turned her attention to the boy.
"And this is Benjamin, I presume?"
It was a statement rather than a question. The child stared back and said nothing. "He's shy with strangers," put in Jennet.
"Of course he is," the woman returned. "All sensitive children are timid."
"Ben's not sensitive, just shy," corrected Jennet firmly.
"Ah, yes. You must forgive me."
Miss Boston's face looked like someone guiltily sucking a boiled sweet.
"Well," she went on, "I trust I shan't be considered a stranger for very much longer, by either of you."
Her smile was warm and genuine.
"Now come," she cried, waving them out of the station. "Let us retire to my home and have a bite to eat before you unpack."
As they left the station, Jennet saw for the first time the town of Whitby. Her eyes scanned up beyond the houses to where the high plane of the cliff reached out to the sea. She gasped and stared, for there, surmounting everything, was a ragged crown of grey stone. The Abbey. The building was in ruins, but that did not diminish its power. The Abbey had dominated Whitby for centuries, and waves of invisible force flowed down from it. The ruin was a guardian, watching and waiting, caring for the little town that huddled beneath the cliff. It was a worshipful thing. Miss Boston nodded.
"Yes," she sighed dreamily. "The Abbey. It is indeed lovely. There has been a church on that site for at least 1400 years. One gets a marvellous sense of permanence living under such an enduring symbol of faith. They say a true inhabitant of Whitby is lost if he cannot see the Abbey."
She paused and looked at the ground.
"Well," she went on again breezily, "there I am, off at tangents again. Come, tea awaits."
Ben had been silent since they had met, but by now he had decided that the old woman was harmless and much friendlier than the Roddice. There were none of those phony smiles and patronising looks which were a feature of the Roddice's way with children. Now his excited eyes saw the fishing boats with their gleaming paintwork, orange nets and lobster pots. A twinge of pleasure tugged at his insides when he thought of actually sailing in one of them. It was not impossible. If the old woman liked him and Jennet, if he kept quiet about certain things, they might just stay here long enough. It was not the sort of house you would expect an old lady to live in. There were no china shepherdesses or rows of dainty cups, no bits of fussy lace, no piles of women's magazines heaped in the corner, no obvious signs of knitting, no fat, lazy cat sprawled on the sofa clawing away at the cushions, and, best of all to Ben, the place did not smell of lavender. He thought he would like it here. Miss Boston was not the average old lady. There was something vital and a little bit eccentric about her. In his bedroom, Ben fumbled with the zip on the blue canvas bag and delved through piles of neatly folded clothes and small treasures. There, right at the bottom, his groping fingers touched what felt like a book. Gently he slid the photograph album out of the bag and stroked it lovingly with his hands. With great care and reverence he opened it and turned the pages. Ben examined the photographs carefully. Here they were, images of his parents locked in happy events, birthdays and holidays sealed into the album forever. He turned the last page. There was the photograph he sought above all, a younger version of himself, sat astride a donkey on the sands at Rill, and beside him were his mother and father. The photograph had been taken on the final day of their last holiday together. 6 months later, both his parents had been killed in a car accident. Ben closed the album, then frowned and chewed his lip. He understood his parents were dead. He and Jennet had gone to the funeral and watched the coffins lowered into that deep hole. So why was it that every now and then, in a mirror at the end of his bed, before he went to sleep, he could see his mother and father smiling at him?
"I knew your dear mamma's aunt," said Miss Boston above the buffeting wind. "And you say Aunt Connie wrote to you about Ben and me?" said Jennet. "Yes. Over the years, we have kept a correspondence going. She was very fond of your mamma, you know. And when she heard about the accident, well—"
They had climbed the 199 steps to the top of the east cliff to see the abbey, only to find it was too late and the man in the office had gone home. Still, there was plenty to see. Jennet spoke into the darkening sky, tilting her head back and sweeping the hair out of her eyes. "Aunt Connie couldn't have coped with me and Ben. She's too old." Miss Boston snorted. "Too old? My dear girl, Constance is a mere sapling compared to me." "But Aunt Connie's 70 and walks with a frame." Miss Boston puckered up her face and asked, "How old do you think I am, child?" 75, Jennet ventured uncertainly. Miss Boston closed her eyes and raised her head. "I am 92, she solemnly informed them. "Don't be alarmed, dear. Some of us do survive for that length of time." "But you're not frail or anything," declared Jennet in surprise. "As to that," Miss Boston lifted a finger to her nose in a gesture of secrecy, "I have little methods all my own." They sat in silence for some time, listening to the wind rushing through the grass and hearing Ben's squawks as he chased the gulls. "Why now?" asked Jennet, breaking the calm. "Why didn't you send for us before? Why wait over 2 years?" "My dear child, I was hoping that you would find a good home with a family that would care for you. Alas, it was not to be. So I decided to enter the fray, and applied a little pressure here, called in some old favours there. Well, here you are, stuck with a terrible old woman like me. I'm sorry, but I could not stand by and let you stay in that hostel until you were 16. I think I ought to tell you something before Ben rejoins us. It's only fair you should know." "What should I know?" "I received a letter from Mrs. Roddice." Miss Boston pulled a sour expression. "Nasty, spiteful letter it was, too. It concerned Benjamin. What an unpleasant creature she must be." The girl glanced up and found Miss Boston looking at her steadily. Now was the time to tell her everything. If that was the end of their stay in Whitby, then so be it. At least she could put the old woman straight. Lord knows what the Roddice had put in that letter. "Ben has dreams," Jennet stammered. "Sometimes he has them in the daytime and gets muddled up. He used to think Mum and Dad came to see him after the accident. That's not all. He used to tell some of the other kids at the hostel funny stuff that frightened them. We had a new girl come who used to live with her gran before she died, and Ben told her he could see an old woman sitting next to her when she was in the TV room, stroking her hair. Apparently that's what this grandmother used to do. Yvonne started to wet the bed after that, and the other kids used to look at Ben as if he was some kind of freak." Miss Boston put her arm round the girl and tried to comfort her. "Well, it won't bother me, I assure you, dear. Benjamin can natter to an army of ghosts, and I shan't mind. I'm nearly one myself, after all. Tell me, do you ever see anything like that?" Jennet shook her head. "No. At first I thought Ben was making it all up, but he wouldn't have kept it up this long, would he? I've told him to stop, but he won't." "Of course, my dear, he cannot. It is the most natural thing in the world for him to see these things. I believe Benjamin is a very special child. He has the sight.
A marvellous gift which should be encouraged. A little distance away, Benjamin was staring down at the rocks below the cliff. He seemed to be watching something. The old woman squinted down and saw a blurred shape move quickly over the stones. "So," she whispered to herself, "he sees the fisher folk also." A slow smile spread over her face. The seagulls woke Ben up. For a moment he wondered where he was, and then he remembered. Hastily he pulled his clothes on and ran downstairs to the kitchen, where he found Jennet finishing her breakfast. "Where's mine?" demanded Ben hungrily. His sister poured some milk into a bowl of cereal and passed it to him. "It's nice here, isn't it, Ben?" said Jennet as she watched him munch his breakfast. He agreed with his mouth full. "I hope we can stay here for a while. She's a nice old lady. I feel a bit funny calling her aunt, though." The latch on the front door rattled, and Aunt Alice stepped in looking windswept and rosy. "There," she puffed. "I like to climb the 199 steps first thing, whatever the weather. Blows the sleepy cobwebs away, it does. Well now, children, what do you intend to do today?" They shrugged and looked at her blankly. "Explore," suggested Jennet. "If you don't mind, that is." "Why should I mind, child? I hope you enjoy yourselves. I shall want to know what you have discovered when you return." "When should we come back, Aunt Alice?" "Oh, whenever you like, dear. I have to go out myself." "But how shall we get in if you're not here?" Aunt Alice dangled a key to the front door between her fingers. "A spare," she said. Jennet thanked the old woman. It had been a long time since anyone had trusted her like this, and she appreciated it. "Just come back when you get hungry," beamed Aunt Alice. "I should be here by lunchtime." It was still early, and Jennet and Ben wandered through the narrow streets, gazing into shop windows that were filled with pieces of Whitby jet. It had been fashioned into all sorts of jewellery, rings, pendants, bracelets and tie-pins. Jennet looked longingly at a pair of jet earrings and stroked the glass dreamily. Ben tutted in disgust and walked away, muttering about the dullness of shops. Jennet ran up to the green door and searched in her pockets for the key. Outside Aunt Alice's cottage was an old barrel which overflowed with geraniums, and about the door itself hung a curiously shaped stone with a hole worn in it. Inside there was no sign of Aunt Alice. Jennet went into the kitchen and decided to make a cup of tea to await the old lady's return. Just as the kettle began to whistle, there came a furtive knock on the front door. "You took your time, Ben," she began. "What happened to—" But when the door opened, she saw that the new arrival was not her brother at all. Another old lady blinked in surprise at her. She was an odd-looking woman with dark grey wiry hair, thick black-rimmed spectacles, and bristling from her top lip and over her chin sprouted a growth of fine white whiskers. "Oh, dear," said the stranger. "I suppose you must be Jennet." "Jennet," the girl corrected. "Of course. I'm Miss Droon, a friend of Alice's. Is she in?" "No, but she should be back soon." And then Miss Droon barged through to the kitchen, where the kettle was whistling for all it was worth and steaming up the windows. "I hope you're right, girl," she returned, "for Eurydice's sake." "Eurydice?" "Yes, she's wandered off again and could go into labour any minute." Miss Droon wrung her hands together anxiously. Jennet had visions of some woman roaming round Whitby ready to give birth. "Maybe she's gone to the hospital," she suggested hopefully. Miss Droon looked at her as if she were mad and opened her mouth. "Are you mad, child? Eurydice is my cat." At that moment the front door opened and in came Aunt Alice with Ben. They had met in Church Street, and Ben was giving her a detailed account of the morning's activities. "Then we saw a statue of Captain Cork, and 2 huge whale bones made into an arch, and I found a fossil thing on the beach, see?" "That's an ammonite, Benjamin. There are lots of them round here." Miss Boston removed her hat before the mirror in the hall. "Sounds like you two have been busy," she said. "Oh," and she paused in the kitchen doorway. "Hello, Tilly. What can I do for you? Everything well?" "It's Eurydice," Miss Droon burst out. "She's gone off, and they're due any minute." "How tiresome," tutted Miss Boston, winking at Jennet. "And you would like me to find her for you, is that it?" "Please, Alice, I just can't bear to think of her coping alone." Miss Boston sighed and filled a jug with cold water. "Very well. Come into the parlour, Tilly. Jennet, could you and Benjamin stay out here for a while and be very quiet?" The children nodded, very puzzled. "Excellent. Now, in you go, Matilda." The sound of voices filtered through the parlour door, so the children kept quiet and listened. After a short while the door was opened, and Miss Droon bustled out. Aunt Alice called after her, pulling back the curtains. "It's that empty house on Abbey Lane. Yes, I'm certain she'll be there." "I must go to her. Poor little Eurydice," cried Miss Droon, fumbling with the front door latch. "Oh, confound the woman," said Miss Boston. "It's no good. I shall have to go with her. Do you children want to come?" Ben began to say that he didn't, but Jennet elbowed him into silence and said of course they would go. "Good," said Aunt Alice, putting her hat back on. Jennet watched her and Ben leave the house. Then, on a sudden impulse, she ran into the parlour. A sweet, heavy scent laced the air. On the table was a jug of water and an empty black lacquered bowl. Jennet went up to it and ran her fingers round the rim. It was wet. So, Aunt Alice filled the bowl with water, drew the curtains, then poured the water back into the jug, she said slowly to herself. But why? And what is that sickly smell? Jennet was mystified. How could all these things lead to the conclusion that Eurydice was in some empty house? The empty house they were heading for was just off the lane that ran behind the abbey, so up the 199 steps they had to go. "There it is," said Miss Boston, pointing to a long two-storied building. It was an ugly little house with mean little windows, quite secluded. "Goodness me," she exclaimed. "Look at that sign. Somebody's actually bought it." The for sale notice, which had stood outside the house for 2 years, now bore a garish red stripe proclaiming sold for all the world to see. "Such neglect," commented Miss Boston sadly. "And look at the path, completely overgrown." Ben's voice called to them from round the back. He had found the kitchen door, and the wood was rotten. There was a large hole at the bottom. "Shall I go in?" asked Ben. "I could easily squeeze through if we made the hole a bit bigger." Ben pulled away more of the crumbling door and wriggled through. A dingy yellow-brown light filtered through the filthy kitchen windows. The whole house felt damp and musty. Ben shivered. What a horrid, dank place it was. He found it hard to believe that someone had actually lived there. The entire house reminded him of a large dungeon. "Eurydice! Eurydice!" he called out feebly as he stood at the bottom of the stairs. Then he heard a noise. "Oh, you would have to be up there, wouldn't you?" He gritted his teeth and hoped that it was the cat who had made the noise, and not some vampire opening the lid of its coffin. It was dark on the first floor, for there was no landing window, and all the bedroom doors were shut. As he went, Ben left the doors open behind him to illuminate the landing. In the growing light he noticed a square opening in the ceiling. "Must be the attic," he whispered to himself. He did not like the look of that deep black hole. It made him uneasy as he passed beneath it. "I hope you're not up there, you daft moggy," he mumbled as he quickly opened the next door. This room was full of cardboard boxes and yellowing old newspapers which the mice had chewed. Ben tiptoed over to the boxes. There was a sudden movement, and he stepped back in alarm.
A furry white head popped up. "Eurydice," sighed Ben, relieved. The cat meowed crossly, staring at him with one green eye and one blue. "Come on, Puss," he said soothingly. He picked up the box she was in, and Eurydice glared at him. "It's all right, Puss," he said, carrying her out of the room. It was only then that Ben began to wonder who had shut the door in the first place. On the landing, Eurydice grew agitated, and her ears pressed flat against her skull. She began to hiss and spit, but not at Ben. The boy turned cold. As he passed under the dark attic opening, all the hairs on the back of his neck prickled and rose. He felt sure something was up there, watching him from the shadows. The same something that could close bedroom doors. He made for the stairs quickly, but as he ran down them 2 at a time, he chanced to turn back and was horrified to see a small, dark figure drop to the landing and begin creeping silently after him. Ben bolted for the kitchen and thrust the box through the gap, scrabbling frantically after it.
"Eurydice, you naughty girl!" scolded Miss Droon. "Don't do that again. I shall lock you in my room from now on."
In the sunlight, Ben's fear seemed irrational. He must have imagined the whole thing. Either that, or the figure was one of his visitors, although he had never felt frightened by their presence before. He decided not to mention it to anyone. Ben turned the ammonite over in his fingers and stared intently at it. Miss Boston had told him that it was incredibly old, older than the human race, in fact. Ben held it tightly. It felt safe to touch something so ancient. There was very little permanence in his turbulent life, and this small, time-polished fossil was like a magic talisman, a sign that perhaps things would be different from now on. It was late, and the 3 of them were sitting in the parlour. The curtains were drawn, and Aunt Alice had lit a fire, as the night had grown chilly.
"Shall I tell you the legend of the Ammonites and St. Hilda?"
Aunt Alice asked them. Ben pushed himself further into the cushions and nodded.
"In the olden times, the Abbess of Whitby was the niece of a great northern king. They were dark, severe days, and most of the people were still pagan, worshipping cruel gods on the moors and at the river mouth. It is said that the cliff top, where the abbey now stands, was alive with snakes. They were such a nuisance that the Lady Hilda took up a whip or staff and drove them all into the sea, where, by her prayers, they were turned to stone. However, the 3 largest serpents had escaped her anger, and they rose out of the grass to strike her. Furiously, she hit out first and cut their heads clean off, while their bodies sailed through the air and were embedded in the wall of a house at the bottom of the 199 steps. They are still there today, if you care to look."
Jennet stirred a little, but still gazed at the flames through narrowed eyes.
"Is any of that true?" she asked. "I mean, was Hilda really the niece of a king?" "Oh, yes," Aunt Alice assured her earnestly. "Edwin of Northumbria was her uncle, though some say her father. She was a princess in any case. Word got round that one of the royal blood was coming to Whitby, and gossip confused the true facts. Rather like Chinese whispers, I imagine. Eventually, half the population believed Hilda was a great sorceress, but we actually know very little about the real woman. The story of the snakes is obviously allegorical, the serpents representing the pagan religion which Hilda overcame. Still, it is a quaint tale. Now I think it's time for you both to go to bed. You've had a busy day, and so have I, what with troublesome cats and balmy old Tilly."
The next day was Saturday, and the beginning of the Folk Week. Early in the morning the children raced round the West Cliff, looking at the odd assortment of people who were turning up. There were Morris dancers, a whole gaggle of bagpipes, long-haired hippies with guitars and peace stickers, a fleet of flutes and penny whistles, a group of mummers dressed in the most outlandish costumes Ben had ever seen, and even 2 belly dancers. A large old Bentley was attempting to plough down Church Street, and the driver was being none too gentle. Jennet and Ben were still staring at the car when it pulled up outside the post office. A large, flabby lady in a silk print dress and fur stole stepped heavily onto the pavement. Her hair was a pale peach colour, and there seemed to be an inch-thick layer of makeup covering her face. Jennet thought she looked like a fat pantomime fairy. Ben began to giggle as the apparition waddled gracelessly towards the post office and brushed past them. Her perfume was incredibly pungent. You could almost taste it. The woman peered down her nose at the children and gave a peculiar excuse for a smile. Ben scowled. "Come on," Jennet said to her brother. "Let's go and have lunch." They found Miss Boston already in the kitchen making ham sandwiches for them, and as they sat down to eat, they told her what they had done that morning. The old lady listened attentively, clucking now and then in wonder or approval. She laughed as they described the Morris dancers, and sucked in her cheeks at the disgraceful behaviour of the Bentley.
"That Banbury Scott woman really is too much," she snorted. "Thinks she owns the town, she does. Her home is one of the largest and probably the oldest round here."
Miss Boston sighed wistfully and took another bite of her sandwich.
"She's very fat,"
said Ben. Jennet kicked him under the table, but Aunt Alice nodded in agreement.
"Yes, she is a bit of a pig," she admitted. "Far too greedy, I'm afraid."
Ben chuckled with surprise and appreciation. He had not expected her to agree with him.
"I didn't like her," said Jennet flatly.
"Not many do," confided Aunt Alice. "Just because she's rich, they put up with her."
"She can't have any real friends, then," said Jennet thoughtfully. "How awful to be liked just because you have money."
"Oh, but she does have friends, dear," Aunt Alice quickly put in. "There's Edith Weathers, the postmistress, Mrs. Joyster, Tilly Droon, and, Here she paused, then added guiltily, "And there's me. In fact, Mrs. Banbury Scott will be coming here tomorrow evening. Our ladies' circle meets once a month." She cleared the plates away while Jennet puzzled over her words. The way Aunt Alice had mentioned the ladies' circle had been strange, as if she was embarrassed and did not want to talk about it. A sudden thought came to her. Perhaps they were secret gamblers and played poker with their pensions. Whatever the reason, it was obvious that she and Ben were not wanted at this meeting, and she wondered what they were supposed to do during it. By a strange coincidence, Aunt Alice was thinking exactly the same thing. It would never do for the children to find out what happened at these meetings, and discover her little secret, she told herself.
"Aunt Alice," said Jennet casually, "I just wanted to know if you wanted Ben and me around when your friends come. We could stay upstairs, if you like."
Miss Boston took hold of Jennet's hands. "Oh, do you think you could, dear?" she said, gleefully puckering up her wrinkled face. "That really would be such a help. Some of the circle are not very fond of children, and we do need to concentrate, you see."
"Don't worry," Jennet said. "I'll take Ben on a long walk to tire him out. You won't hear a peep from him all night."
Aunt Alice frowned to herself. Could Jennet have found out somehow? Perhaps it was not too late to cancel the meeting. "I must make this the very last meeting of the circle," she insisted to herself. "It will get too dangerous if the children become involved, especially for Benjamin." Ben's window did not overlook the yard, so he missed the arrival of the old lady's guests. A sharp knock vibrated on the front door and startled him. He sat up and listened to see if he could hear who it was, as Miss Boston let the newcomer in. Then his own door opened, and Jennet, wrapped in a towel with another turban around her hair, looked in.
"Now, have you got everything you want?" she said. "You're not to go downstairs tonight, do you understand? If you so much as sit on the top step, there'll be trouble, okay?"
Ben threw himself on his back sulkily. Jennet closed the door and went to her own room. The light faded outside Ben's window, and the shadows deepened in his room. The boy fell into a light, uneasy sleep which was invaded by unpleasant dreams. A howl boomed inside his head, a weird, unearthly sound that slashed the night. With a hideous growl, the unseen beast bore down on him. The creature was snapping at his heels, and with a shriek he called out, "Mum! Mum!" Ben found himself sitting up in bed, drenched with sweat. The room was dark, yet he could make out the figure sitting quite clearly beside him. "Mum!" he whispered. The figure smiled at him, as any mother might do to comfort her child in the night. Ben put out his arms to embrace her, but she rose and backed away. Puzzled, the boy clambered out of bed. His mother pointed at the doorknob. Trembling, Ben reached out a hand, slowly opened the door and peered out. He was totally unprepared for what was on the other side and gasped in disbelief. There, crammed on the small landing, was a multitude of visitors. Ben could only shake his head and stare. He had never seen this many together before. The ghosts of over 100 people were there. A long line of them trailed down into the hall and gathered outside the closed parlour door. For a moment Ben felt afraid, and pulled himself back into the bedroom. But his qualms disappeared as the light which flickered around the apparitions welled up and illuminated the stairwell from top to bottom with a beautiful radiance. Ben stepped onto the landing and instantly regretted it. Every soul rushed towards him. They wrung their hands piteously before his face, their expressions desperate with the need to communicate with the living. What were these spirits doing here, and what did they want? It was as if they had been dragged here against their wills, and were beseeching him to release them. He had to escape from this clamouring madness, and he groped for the door to Jennet's room. The throng of spirits parted before him like scythed corn. There it was, the doorknob. He fumbled for a moment and flung himself inside. "Oh, Jen!" he howled, throwing himself at her. "They won't leave me alone, Jen! Tell them to go away, will you?" Jennet stroked his hair and tried to soothe him. It was a long time since Ben had had one of his turns, and she wondered that he should have one now. He seemed so happy here. Are you seeing things again, Ben?" she ventured. He nodded into her shoulder. Jennet pushed him away from her and looked steadily into his eyes. For a moment all her old suspicions about his visions had flooded back. But no, he was really scared. "Don't worry," she told him calmly. "I'll take a look outside and make sure there's no one there." She got up and crossed to the door, but Ben sprang past her and slammed himself against it violently. "Don't go out," he begged. "You'll let them in." "Don't worry, Ben," she said, pulling him from the door. "I won't let anyone in, I promise." The boy backed towards the bed as she turned the knob and opened the door. She could see nothing out there, but he could. On the landing the crowd of souls raised their arms and surged forward. Ben screamed and collapsed on the bed. Jennet was horrified. She raced down the stairs, calling for Aunt Alice at the top of her voice. Up to the parlour door she ran and, without knocking, thrust it open and charged inside. Seated at the round parlour table was the ladies' circle. The corpulent and heavily made-up Mrs. Banbury Scott, the bewhiskered Miss Droon, Miss Weathers, a nervous and mouse-like creature whom Jennet had glanced in the post office, Miss Joyster, a frowning stern woman, and finally Aunt Alice. They were all holding hands, and looked extremely startled by Jennet's entrance. She had interrupted a séance. Aunt Alice sucked her cheeks in guiltily. "Oh dear," she began, but did not know what else to say. Anger quickly replaced the surprise which Jennet had at first felt. All this time Aunt Alice had deceived her. She felt cheated and used. The old woman wasn't interested in her at all. She just wanted Ben because of his gift. Her resentment welled up until she could contain it no longer. "I hate you," she stormed. "You're nothing but a load of old witches." She slammed the door and stomped upstairs to pack her things, and Ben's. They weren't going to stay in this house any longer. She didn't care where they went, just so long as they got away. Aunt Alice glanced at the large bag which the girl was filling. She clutched at the door frame and asked fretfully, "But, my dear, what are you doing? Are you going somewhere?" "You lied to me," Jennet snorted. "You let me think you wanted me here. How long would it have been before you involved Ben in your games?" Miss Boston stared at the carpet, thoroughly abashed. "What I have done is unforgivable. I'm sorry." "Too late for that now. You frightened Ben half to death." The old lady raised her eyebrows eagerly. "Really? Why? What did he see?" "You don't stop, do you?" Jennet gasped incredulously. "You just don't care. He might have been sent round the twist, and all you're interested in is what sort of ghosts he saw." Aunt Alice shook her head. "That isn't true," she denied vehemently. "Of course I'm concerned." Jennet sat down on the bed and sobbed bitterly. Aunt Alice sat next to her. "Let me explain, Jennet dear," she said gently. "When I was a young girl, not much older than yourself, I saw things I didn't understand." "Like Ben, you mean?" "Exactly so. But at that time, my mamma forbade me to say anything about them. In those days, children were not spared the rod, and I soon learnt to save my poor hands from the cane by ignoring what I saw. A gift such as I possessed goes into decline if neglected," Aunt Alice said sadly. "And I neglected it for very many years." "So what were you doing downstairs?" asked Jennet, totally unmoved. Miss Boston heaved a great sigh. "I do wish you'd be a little less prickly, Jennet dear. I'm afraid that what you saw was one of my attempts to regain the gift. The circle meets every month for what Mrs. Banbury Scott jokingly calls spirits and scones." A wild and windy Monday kept most of the tourists indoors, to the irritation of the landladies and the profit of the arcade owners. In the afternoon, Ben went for a walk alone. Jennet was brooding in her room, and he sensed the tension between her and Aunt Alice. But at least they were staying in Whitby. Eventually he came to the church and stood on its steps, leaning on the handrail. Chewing a piece of grass, he contemplated the previous night's happenings. He was not exactly sure why Jennet had been so cold towards Aunt Alice that morning, but it must have had something to do with what he had seen. Ah, if only he was like everyone else. His gaze followed the progress of a boat as it sailed to sea, and as he turned his head to do so, something startled him. On one of the tomb slabs in the graveyard sat a small figure. It was as large as a child, and wore a dark blue fishing jersey. Its back was turned to Ben so he could not see the face. A thick tangle of brown hair suggested it might be a girl. Something buzzed inside his head. Ben shook himself and rubbed his eyes. He was not certain, but he thought it was one of his visitors. The boy was at once afraid and yet greatly interested. With the tip of his tongue pressed over his top lip in concentration, he stepped over the grass towards the tomb where she sat. Closer and closer he stepped, his heart pounding. Then, just as he came within reach, the figure moved and turned her face full on him. Ben froze. He had never beheld anything like it before. The creature was not human. Her face was like soft leather. The nose was large and upturned, with a small mouth shaped like a crescent moon, and cheeks burned brown by the wind. Yet it was her eyes that transfixed the boy. They were as big as his fists and as grey as the stormy sea, and the wrinkles which framed them spread about her brow like ripples on the shore. "You see me, human child," she said simply. Ben could only nod in reply. The creature averted her eyes, and he felt as though invisible chains released him. "Never have I met one with the sight," she continued, her face breaking into a grin. "Who are you?" he stammered at last. "I am Nelda," she answered teasingly. "But that was not your meaning. I am a wanderer of the shore. Our folk dwell by the sea, and have done so long before your kind came." Ben frowned. "But why haven't I heard of you before? Nobody's ever mentioned you to me." Nelda smiled. "That is because man no longer remembers or believes in us. We fade away," she muttered darkly. "Aufweder was the name which once you gave to us. But now who recalls it? Very few, I think." Ben still did not understand. Shaking his head, he asked, "But why have they, we, forgotten? Surely people must see you when—" Even as he said the words, he realized what she meant. Only people like him could see them. "Oh," he muttered slowly. She laughed, swinging her legs off the tomb and leaping to the ground. "That's right, human child," Nelda gurgled. "No one will believe you if you tell them. If you have seen one of the fisher folk, they shall think you mad." The strange creature prepared to leave, but Ben caught her arm. With a shock he realized that she was real and alive, not one of his visitors at all. "Don't go yet," he pleaded. "My name's Ben." The Aufweder considered him for a moment, and the smile flickered over her face again. "Why should I linger here?" she asked mildly. "Already I have dared much just to speak with you. I must go." Then, as she turned to nod farewell, the boy caught sight of raw emotion in her eyes, and was jolted out of his dumbness. There was something troubling her. "Can't I help?" he asked. Nelda studied him. How could a human child know of her pain, she wondered. Perhaps the elders were wrong, and some of them could be trusted. "What age do you reckon me?" she asked him suddenly. Ben shrugged. He was not very good at guessing people's ages, and it usually upset them when he got it wrong. "I am 70 of your years," said Nelda. "Yet I am the youngest of my tribe. A mere whelp I am to them. Though I have lived in this world since before your father was born, you and I are probably of similar age to our blood kin." "I haven't got a father," Ben told her. "He's dead." "I fear my father is dead also," she said. Ben started and glanced at her. "Don't you know?" he asked. "My father has not been seen for over 2 weeks now," she explained. "Doesn't mean he's dead, though." Nelda pressed the fingers of her left hand against her brow and sighed. "Oh, it does not end there. My uncle is missing also." Ben nibbled his lip uncomfortably. He was not sure what to say. "I'm sorry," he murmured quietly. At this Nelda snorted. "Pah! I care not for him. He is nothing to me." She paused to spit on the ground with disgust. "Like the scum which floats now on the water he is," she said, shuddering. "The elders only suffer him for the sake of my Aunt Hesper. No, my belief is that Silas has done a black deed. I fear he has murdered my father." In part, Ben understood what she was going through. Human or not, she still had feelings. "Both my parents were killed in a crash but at least I knew they were really dead and not just missing. Must be awful not to know." "Then we are both orphans, Ben," she breathed. "I never knew my mother. She died when I was born, as do all Aufweder mothers now." Nelda fell silent, as though she had said too much, then squinted at the pale sun. It was time for her to go. She got to her feet and said, "I must return to my people." "Do you have to?" Ben protested. "Can't you stay just a little bit longer?" She looked down at Ben and rashly said, "Tomorrow, when the sun is as now." And with a quick, desperate look, Nelda dashed to the steps and sped down them. Ben stayed where he was. He had touched another world that nobody knew anything about. The boy could hardly wait for the next day. The gulls were not yet awake, and the night fisherman was still out at sea. All Whitby slept, and the streets were still and silent as death. On the treacherously smooth, slippery shore 3 small figures appeared. They seemed to step out of the sheer cliff face, though in the gloom it was impossible to see properly. They were 3 Aufweders. Slowly and deliberately they went, pausing only to peer into rock pools that the tide had left behind, and to part the thick clumps of weed washed ashore. They were searching for something. Nelda's grandfather, Tar, prodded a loose heap of shale with his staff, as he had done every morning for the past fortnight. His old bones ached, and he grumbled to himself.
"Us'll never find it out now. Been too long, I says. Them's gone for good."
He stared along the shore at Nelda and Hesper.
"Them won't never give up,"
he muttered with a groan.
"Canna tell 'em nowt."
Hesper was his daughter. She was also the missing Silas's wife, and Nelda's aunt. A kindly soul, everyone liked her. Or was it pity they felt? She had married the leering Silas Gull against her father's wishes nigh on 200 years ago. With a battered oilskin hat perched on her head and a cork lifebelt fastened around her waist, Hesper was a comical sight. Her face had the texture of a pickled walnut, but the lines which had etched themselves so deeply there were the marks of sorrow and care. To the rest of the tribe Hesper was a tragic figure, solitary and quiet, speaking to none but her family. Even she did not know if she still loved Silas. Whatever had first attracted her to him had quickly disappeared. However, Hesper's heart was kept aflame by her true passion, her unceasing search for that which could lift the curse from the fisher folk. She was accustomed to the ridicule her quest invited, but her faith was never shaken. At this moment, however, she had just noticed a tangled mass of green nylon net in the hollow between 2 boulders. Hesper climbed on to one of the smooth, wet rocks and looked down into the untidy mess. Hesper breathed in sharply. "Nelda," she uttered in a fearful voice. "Fetch Tar at once." The net was held down by large, round weights. Hesper leaned over and with difficulty hauled some of it away. "9 times bless me!" she exclaimed, and clapped a hand over her mouth in horror. For there, revealed beneath the chaotic jungle of net and weed, was a body. Tar strode up as fast as he could. What had his daughter found, he asked himself. As he drew near to where Hesper was kneeling, he could hear her cries of despair, and saw that she had removed her hat. "Stay here," he told Nelda when they reached the rock. "Tha's too young to look on what she's found." With an effort he pulled himself up the slippery rock and gazed down into the hollow. "Deeps, take me," he gasped. He stretched his legs over the side so that he could drop down beside the body. There was only one way of identifying such a grisly corpse, by the pattern on its jersey. For many years the jersey, or gansey as the fisherfolk called it, was not merely an item of clothing. The arrangement of ribs and cables upon each was like a family crest. One close look would tell him who it was. With a trembling hand he rolled the body over. "Nah," he whispered as he inspected the complicated rows. "Them's gull stitches right enough." Here, then, was Silas Gull, the black sheep of the tribe, a rascal descended from rogues. There would not be many who would weep over his loss. Only Hesper, perhaps. Tar whistled softly to himself as the significance of this discovery sank in. So it was Silas who had been murdered, and, from the look of things, by Nelda's father. A fierce scowl formed on Tar's face. "Tha's in deep, dark waters, eh, blood?" he murmured. "And tha canna hide forever." The heels of Miss Boston's shoes clicked over the beautifully polished wooden floor. She had brought the children to the Panet Park Museum, and was thoroughly enjoying showing them round. Aunt Alice watched Jennet's expression with satisfaction. They lingered by the display of jet, and the girl was dazzled by the craftsmanship of the tiaras and brooches. The old lady beamed and rubbed her hands together. Soon all that unpleasantness would be forgotten. So long as she stuck to her side of the bargain, all would be well. Whilst they were looking at the next exhibit, a model of how the abbey looked before its central tower collapsed in 1830, some distance away Ben licked his top lip and stared down wide-eyed. For the first time that morning his interest was engaged. In a glass case, all on its own, was one of the most hideous objects he had ever seen. A severed human hand. It must have been very old, for the skin was dry and grey, but you could still see the fingernails and wrinkles on its knuckles. A delighted shiver ran down Ben's back. He loved macabre horrors like this. Jennet and Miss Boston soon joined him. The girl pulled a face, and the old lady's chins quivered as she explained what the ghastly thing was. "A hand of glory," she uttered in a thrilled whisper. "This unpleasant little item was used as a charm by witches and burglars many years ago." "What as?" asked Jennet grimly. "A back-scratcher?" Aunt Alice cackled. "It was believed in those times that this charm, if properly used, could put to sleep an entire household, so that a thief could ransack the place without anybody stirring." Aunt Alice paused and waited for encouragement to continue. There was none, so she rattled on regardless. "A true hand of glory had to be cut from a man while he was still dangling from the gallows. It then had to be pickled and dried, and the fingers set alight." Aunt Alice stopped in mid-sentence, for Jennet had balked and was looking ill. "I think I'll sit outside, if you don't mind," Jennet said quietly. "I need some fresh air." Miss Boston blinked and assumed her guilt-ridden face. "Oh dear," she murmured. "I think it's time we left too, Benjamin." To celebrate their truce, Aunt Alice and Jennet went into a small cafe for a cream tea. There they met another of the old lady's friends. Mr. Roper was a soft-spoken old man, smelling of brilliantine and mothballs. He pulled his chair over to their table and proceeded to tell them the morning's gossip. Among the useless titbits he divulged was one interesting fact, however. A Mrs. Rowena Cooper had just moved into the house on Abbey Lane. At last the evening came. With his heart in his mouth, Ben ran up the 199 steps and stared about the graves. There she was, the youngest of the fisherfolk, sitting on the same tombstone and staring at the white-crested waves far below. She turned as she heard Ben running towards her, and the face he saw was marked with worry and pain. "I cannot stay," she told him at once. "My uncle has been found." "Oh," said Ben, "what does that mean? Was he hiding? Had he done something horrible to your father?" She pulled the woolen hat from her head and let the wind seize her hair. "Silas was dead when we found him," she answered simply. "It was he who had been killed." For a moment Ben struggled to understand what she was saying, and then it dawned on him. "You mean your father did it?" Nelda squeezed her large grey eyes shut and spoke with anguish. "Never!" she cried. "He is gentle and kind. My father would not harm anything." A gull screeched overhead, and its voice reminded Nelda that she did not have time to talk at length. "I must go now," she told him. "There is much to do, for we send Silas on his way tonight." She was interrupted suddenly by a shocked voice. "Nelda!" it shrieked. The Aufwader jumped off the tombstone as if stung and stared round in terror. Coming up the grassy slope was her aunt. Hesper was waving her arms about like a demented windmill, and her wrinkled face had turned a peculiar shade of purple. "A human child with the sight!" she cried as she ran to her niece, skirting round Ben as if he were a bomb that might explode at any moment. "Nelda, I thought you were wiser than to mix with such creatures. And today, of all days—" She pulled up the life-belt which had fallen round her knees and continued. "Come away this instant. The prayer is ready to be spoken." "Oh, don't blame her," Ben piped up. "I made her talk to me." Hesper's crinkled face studied him distastefully for a moment before turning back to her niece. "Return with me now, and we shall speak no more of this." Nelda threw her arms around her aunt's neck. "You mean you won't tell? Oh, thank you." "Won't I see you again, then?" Ben asked miserably. Nelda hung her head and prepared to say farewell to her human friend. She knew it was wrong for her to hope of seeing Ben again, and yet a strange feeling swept over her like nothing she had ever experienced before. Out of her body she drifted, and visions of things to come flashed past her. She saw a white, billowing shape high on the cliff-top, and heard the beat of pagan drums. A glowing form shimmered from the depths of the sea, and she uttered a cry of astonishment when she recognized— With a sickening lurch, the scene was snatched away and her blood turned to ice. A huge, gaping maw rushed towards her. She heard the vicious hatred in its voice as a nightmarish growl issued from the scarlet throat. Nelda screamed and stumbled backwards, waving her arms before her face to fend off the evil which attacked her. Hesper and Ben knelt down by the Aufwader's side. Nelda choked back a cry as she clutched her aunt's arm. "I saw it, Hesper! The moon kelp!" Nelda exclaimed frenziedly. "The time is near! You were right all along!" Hesper gawped at her in disbelief for a second, then let loose a terrific squeal of glee. Ben covered his ears and wondered why they were so excited. Finally Nelda remembered him and hurriedly told her aunt, "I know not how this vision came to be, but I am sure this human child is caught up in our plight. Hesper, do you not see? Spurn him now, and the curse will engulf us all." Her voice and her words were powerful, and Hesper did not doubt that she had been shown a glimpse of the future. The wisdom of the cold deeps had touched her for a moment. "Then we must tell the child of our woe," she said simply. Hesper struggled to her feet and looked at Ben. "Listen to me, unhappy man-pup," she told him soberly. "All that you hear from this moment on must not cross your lips into another's hearing. You understand?" Ben mumbled that he did, not sure if he were prepared for what she was about to tell him. Hesper gazed into the distance and began, "For many years my people obeyed the strict rules of the elders, and man forgot us, until that fateful day, that day which all rue now." "What happened?" asked Ben, overawed. "The two races mingled," Nelda answered darkly. "A fisherman, with the same sight you possess, took to wife one of our kind, and a child was born." "A creature that did not belong in either world," said Hesper sadly. "The moment it breathed its first breath, the lords of the deep were aware of it, and knew that the laws they had made had been broken. When the fisherman next set sail to cast his nets, the lords of the deep rose against him and dragged his boat under the waves. On hearing this, the child's mother became mad with grief. She threw herself off this very cliff and was dashed to pieces on the rocks below." "There is more," said Nelda. "Cheated of their revenge, the lords vented their wrath on all women of our race." "What did they do?" ventured Ben. "They condemned every female of our race to die in childbirth. A bitter vengeance it is that destroys love." Hesper laid her hand gently on Nelda's arm. "Now you see why we are doomed. For we cannot prosper, and our future is bleak. Our tribes have dwindled in number, and now only one remains, the gleanings of the others." Ben stared at the ground. It was a horrible story, and one he wished he had not heard. "Do not grieve yet," cried Nelda, "for there is hope." A dreamy look stole over Hesper's face. "The moon kelp," she murmured longingly. "I heard the story by the fireside when I was younger than Nelda. Una was a great teller of tales, very wise she was, in many ways, save the one. She too believed in the moon kelp, the treasure of the deep ones that was stolen by Earl from their dark cold realm. Only once in 900 years does it bloom, and then for one night only, when the moon is brightest in the sky." "But how does that help?" said Ben, shaking his head in confusion. "Because whoever finds the lost treasure of the lords of the deep may ask of them anything that is in their power to give," blurted out Nelda. "Do you not see? If we could find the moon kelp, we could ask them to lift the curse." "I see," Ben whistled. "But how can I help?" "Just how you are involved, I am not certain," Nelda told him excitedly. "But for an instant back there, I saw the moon kelp, and you were holding it, human child." The following few days were extremely busy. Ben secretly met Nelda and Hesper, and together they searched the shallows for the moon kelp. Jennet began to wonder what he found to do between tea and supper, but all inquiries yielded no clues. She even offered to go with him, but these suggestions were always firmly refused. Jennet was mystified, but too tired to press him any further, for she had not been sleeping at all well lately. An animal was howling in the night, keeping her awake. Jennet would have talked about it to Aunt Alice, but the old lady seemed to be having problems of her own. Everybody, it seemed, had met the confounded Mrs. Cooper, except Aunt Alice. It seemed the newcomer was a paragon in every respect. She had already made large donations to the church fund and hospital appeal, and everyone she met described her as a warm and sincere individual. Mrs. Cooper had asked the circle, her ladies' circle, to tea, without inviting her. This was tantamount to a slap in the face, and she would be a laughing-stock in the town. Was this woman deliberately trying to provoke her? Aunt Alice, even though she had not yet met Mrs. Cooper, had built up a violent dislike towards her. "The audacity!" she raged. "The sheer—" An envelope on the floor suddenly caught her eye. Curiously, she opened it and raised her eyebrows as she read its contents. "Dearest Miss Boston, I hope you will not think this letter intrusive, but I have heard so many interesting and curious things about you, and as yet we have not been introduced. You must be the one person I have not met. Would you do me the honour of joining myself and a few friends for tea at the Hawthorns this afternoon, say 3:45? Yours sincerely, Rowena Cooper." "Good gracious," muttered Miss Boston in surprise. "A most peculiar invitation, to be sure." At 3:30, Miss Boston's cloaked figure trundled up Abbey Lane. The dark bulk of the Hawthorns reared before her, and the old lady held her breath in astonishment. It could have been a different house, so drastic was the change. The jungle of weeds and nettles had been transformed into a neat garden, and the ground-floor window, which only last week was boarded up, had been replaced and now bore the words "Cooper Antiques" in large red and gold letters. She could not understand how Mrs. Cooper had managed it all in such a short time. "Alice!" an awkward voice called. It was Edith Weathers, the dithery postmistress, waving half-heartedly from the rear of the house. "This way," she said. Miss Boston trotted down the path to the kitchen, where she noticed that the door had been replaced, too. Edith shuffled back inside. "Rowena's busy with the tea upstairs," she explained dutifully. "So she sent me down to guide you in. The front's for business only. This way." Miss Boston shuddered as she followed Edith up the stairs. There was something creepy about the place. Everything was in order, and yet— They reached the landing, and Miss Weathers pushed open the door of what had once been a bedroom. "Here she is, Rowena," the postmistress declared. "Alice Boston." The old lady entered the room. It had been tastefully furnished to serve as a parlour, and sitting on the plush armchairs were all the ladies' circle, and Rowena Cooper. She was a striking woman, tall and slim, with short strawberry-blonde hair and pale, almost translucent skin. Late 40s to early 50s, Aunt Alice guessed. She was wearing a loose purple sweater with black slacks, and her feet were bare. The toenails painted a bright pillar-box red. "Delighted," Mrs. Cooper cooed, rising from her seat and stretching out her arms theatrically. "At last we meet. I feel we shall be such friends, you and I." Aunt Alice managed a smile, although she instantly disliked the gushing woman. "You must call me Rowena," Mrs. Cooper oozed to Miss Boston as she hung up the old lady's hat and cloak. "And I shall call you Alice. Do sit down and have some tea. Mrs. Banbury Scott— Dora, was just telling me about her delicious house." Rowena drooled in an envious tone. "How I've always wanted a home like that. You must invite me round to see it sometime. And you must tell me who does your hair," she treacled. "That peach tint suits you so well." The blubbery Mrs. Banbury Scott fluttered her false eyelashes and giggled coyly as she reached for another eclair. "Do you like the chocolate on those?" Rowena asked Mrs. Banbury Scott. "I must admit I'm a real chocoholic, too." She waved her fingers excitedly and cried, "Don't move! There's something you must try. Excuse me a moment, everyone." Mrs. Cooper slipped out of the room. When she had gone, Miss Boston let out a great sigh. "Preposterous!" she snorted indignantly. "Here we are!" Rowena came bursting back into the room, carrying a small gold cardboard box. "I have a friend in Belgium," she explained, "who sends me these, knowing my passion for them. She handed the box to Mrs. Banbury Scott. The fat pig woman took it greedily and peered inside. "Wonderful!" Mrs. Banbury Scott declared, with her mouth full of truffles and coffee creams. "Oh, these are sublime!" A painful hour crawled by, in which one of the ladies' circle, Prudence Joyster, scrutinized Mrs. Cooper through half-closed eyes, as though she were trying to see what the woman might have looked like 20 or 30 years ago. Finally, Miss Boston decided it was time for her to return home and see to the children's tea. She rattled her cup impatiently on its saucer and said to her hostess, "Most enlightening afternoon. So glad to have met you. I really must get back to see Jennet and Benjamin." At that moment Prudence Joyster rose to leave also. "Yes, a very interesting time," she muttered distractedly. In the lane Aunt Alice walked alongside Mrs. Joyster. "Well, Prudence, I think she must have something to hide. Do you know anything about her husband? Is he dead, or are they separated?" Prudence brought herself to a standstill and clasped her handbag to her chest. "Husband," she repeated. "Of course. The husband." Her face clouded over, and she became very troubled indeed. "Whatever is it?" inquired Miss Boston. "I can't say," Prudence replied. "I'm not certain yet, but... well, it just won't do if I am right about this." Prudence Joyster went home, and still wearing her coat, she knelt by a panel of shelves in the study, which was decorated with mementos of hers and her late husband's time in Africa, and ran her fingers along the spines of books. She knew it had to be there. This was the one thing of her husband she had made a point of keeping. "Ah!" Prudence grunted. "There you are." She eased out a leather-bound book and turned the first page. "Diary of Major Howard Joyster, 1959 to 1967, she read quietly to herself. Page after page of well-ordered, disciplined handwriting flicked beneath her searching fingers. Oh, if she could only remember the correct year! And then the diary yielded its secret at last. "Thursday, 15th July. Bad news. Terrible business at the village. That ruddy couple have got half the Maasai involved in some foul ceremony. Never heard such a commotion, and the wails of the women is a sound I shan't ever forget. They keep talking about a big dog or something. Scared to death they look, too. Nathan and Rosalind Crozier deserve to hang for this." Prudence Joyster laid the book on her knee, feeling sick. Rosalind Crozier, that young, evil woman she had met all those years ago, was none other than Rowena Cooper. An angry look crossed Prudence Joyster's face. She thought of what they had done, and her hands trembled with fury. Slamming the diary on the floor, she stormed out of the house. There were no lights on in the ugly house, and for a second it seemed to shimmer, and the renovations disappeared. Tangled weeds overran the garden once more. The front window was boarded up, and a smell of damp and decay greeted Mrs. Joyster as she pushed the rusted gate open. Then, suddenly, it was back to normal. It was as if she had caught the house off guard momentarily. The window displayed its red and gold letters, and the lawn was neat again. Prudence took no notice. It would take more than night-time imaginings to cool her temper. She went briskly to the kitchen door and hammered violently on it. A light snapped on upstairs, and she heard footsteps coming down the hall. "Prudence!" exclaimed a surprised Mrs. Cooper. "You can stop pretending," snapped Mrs. Joyster furiously. "I know who you are. Rosalind." Mrs. Cooper's face froze. "Don't bother denying it," snapped Mrs. Joyster. "I knew there was something. You and that devil husband, wherever he is." Rowena ground her teeth together, and an unpleasant sneer curled her mouth. "I thought you might have forgotten. What will you do now?" she asked with calculating calm. "Have you called the police?" Prudence glared back at the woman. "Not yet," she said. "But I shall, and don't think you can escape this time." She whirled round, and her sensible shoes rang over the path as she left. Framed in the doorway, Rowena heard the woman's footsteps disappear into the mist, and throwing back her head, let loose a horrible laugh. "Run, Prudence," she called wildly. "Hurry home, if you can." The 199 steps trailed into darkness below as the fog swirled about Mrs. Joyster's ankles and concealed the streets of Whitby. She might have been standing on the roof of the world for all she could see. A shudder ran down her spine, and she glanced back nervously. Resolutely she began the long descent. It was tough going, for the fog lay thickly over the steps and made it impossible to see them. With one hand she gripped the rail tightly and covered her throat with the other. The night was cold, yet Mrs. Joyster's forehead dripped with perspiration. She felt afraid. Someone was watching her. Her heart pounded in her chest as she neared the halfway point. It thumped like the drums she had heard in Kenya, tribal beats that echoed into the night. She was breathing hard. The blood in her temples pumped in time to the drums, and her footsteps faltered. With an overwhelming sense of dread she turned and looked back once more. "No!" she cried in terror. "No!" But it was too late. There on the topmost step was the most horrifying sight she had ever witnessed. Under the dim glow of the lamp she saw an immense hound. It was as large as a calf, blacker than midnight, and its fiery red eyes burned into her. The demon dog took the steps 5 at a time and bore unerringly down upon the petrified woman. "No!" she wailed, raising her arms before her face as the beast snarled and prepared to spring. Its muscular shoulders tensed. Then the creature launched itself straight at her. With a last piteous cry, Prudence Joyster fell back into the fog. Miss Boston sat down and mechanically sipped the hot sweet tea Jennet had made for her. "Poor Prudence," she said shakily. The body of Mrs. Joyster had been discovered early that morning. She had evidently lost her footing whilst descending the steps in the fog the previous night. At least, that's what the police thought. Aunt Alice went round to the dead woman's house. Some time ago Prudence had given her a spare key, and she used this now to let herself in. She found the house just as her friend had left it the night before. The lamp in the study was still on, and the old diary lay sprawled on the floor. "Curious," the old lady murmured as she examined the book. "I wonder what Prudence was doing reading this. Used to upset her so." She recalled how strange Prudence had been yesterday when they parted. There had been something troubling her. Something to do with Rowena Cooper. If only she had said more at the time. A nasty suspicion was forming in Miss Boston's mind. The steps were on the way to Mrs. Cooper's house. Perhaps Prudence had paid a second visit to the dreadful woman last night. She stuffed the diary into her capacious handbag to read later, deciding there had to be some sort of clue in there. One thing was certain. Prudence Joyster had not died in any accident. Jennet rammed her hands into the deep pockets of her coat. The town of Whitby lay behind her, and she scanned the beaches for signs of Ben. He had gone out directly after tea again. It was a most annoying habit of his. She had no idea where he got to, but he usually came back in time for supper. Tonight, however, he had not returned. It was now 10:30, and she was worried. Aunt Alice had gone over to Miss Droon's some time ago, and she had not come back either, so Jennet went out to look for her troublesome brother alone. Jennet turned her head to the east cliff and gazed at the abbey. Her eyes wandered to the church, and then she gasped. Fluttering among the gravestones was a figure in white. Jennet wondered if Ben had taken a sheet from his bed and was playing ghosts up there. Jennet hurried back along the pier and ran up the steps. She glanced round the churchyard, but there was no sign of the white figure. It must have moved behind the church. She followed the path round to the far side of the church and scanned the expanse of headstones for her brother. There it was, the figure in white. Jennet stared at it for some time before she realised that it was too tall to be Ben. The figure was near the cemetery wall, staring out to the sea with the wind tugging at his white robes. The garment was oddly familiar, but as it flapped in the wind it was difficult to be sure. Suddenly Jennet bit her lip in surprise. The stranger was one of the sisters from the nearby convent. The novice lifted her downcast head and turned it slightly to one side. Her face was extraordinary. Not pretty, yet too unusual to be plain. Her eyes were almond-shaped, and the moonlight danced in them, but her mouth was too wide, it almost went from one side of her face to the other. Very quietly she began to weep. The soft whimpers floated into the night, and in her hiding-place Jennet felt miserable. She had never heard such a sound before. It wrenched at her heart and tore into her soul. The anguish was unbearable. It was as if the grief of centuries came pouring out in one fierce torrent of despair. Jennet trembled as the novice's voice rose, and the weeping became a horrible scream. Jennet hid her face and covered her ears until she could bear it no longer. "Stop! Stop!" she cried suddenly. The woman whirled round in surprise, her face stricken with fear. She watched Jennet come out of the hiding-place, and her eyes were wide with fright. "I only want to help," Jennet assured her. But before she could say anything else, the sister darted away. Through the maze of graves she ran, as though a demon were after her. Jennet found herself shaking. Whether from the cold or nerves she could not say. Shivering, she walked home. There she found Ben and the old lady finishing off their cocoa in the parlour. After she had drunk the steaming cup of hot chocolate which was waiting for her, the girl went straight to bed, without even asking Ben where he had been. A little while later, from the moonlit world outside, a dreadful howl boomed into the night, shattering the illusion of calm. Jennet jumped to the window. It was the sound she had been hearing in her dreams. A sickening fear gripped her stomach as she realized they had not been nightmares after all. There was something prowling the streets of Whitby at night. All at once the light in the yard was cut off, eclipsed by a large black shape. Its shadows stretched into the yard. It was that of an enormous hound. The shade grew blacker and larger as the beast crept further into the alley towards the yard. In that narrow tunnel of darkness, 2 points of light glimmered malevolently. Jennet stepped back and clasped her hands tightly over her mouth to stop herself screaming. The shadow lengthened, flowing over the doorstep and up to the lock. But when it reached the curious stone hung above the lintel, it halted abruptly. A deep growl vibrated through the air. The round, hollow stone over the front door was madly dancing on its thread, jerking and banging against the wall as if trying to get free. Small sparks of blue fire crackled from the hole at its centre and splashed down onto the threshold of the cottage like a waterfall of flame. The eyes retreated back down the alley, and a hideous snarl reverberated about the yard. The calm returned, broken only by the sound of distant claws as they clattered up the abbey steps. The screeching of the gulls heralded a new morning. Miss Boston tiptoed down the stairs, careful not to wake the children. She slung a cloak over her shoulders and opened the front door. "Good heaven!" she exclaimed. The doorstep was covered in a fine coating of ash and cinders. The old lady looked up to where the stone had hung, but only the thread remained, and that was black and charred. Her face became grave. "I see," she said in a whisper. "So that is what I am dealing with. I should have guessed as much." Miss Boston was troubled, and walked with her eyes fixed on the ground, as though it might yield up some clue to the mystery of Prudence's death. She was not aware of the direction she was going, but when she looked up she found herself outside the police station. It seemed to be exceedingly busy for this early hour. Miss Boston pushed open the door and went inside. "Good morning, Constable," she said to the young man behind the reception desk. "I say, has something exciting occurred?" The constable leaned forward and whispered, "Burglary last night at Panic Park." "The museum? Good heavens! What was stolen?" gasped Miss Boston. "Only one exhibit was removed from the premises, madam. The Hand of Glory." Miss Boston said nothing, but her face was a picture of bewilderment, which gradually changed to one of concern. "I see," she muttered softly, and with that she left. That afternoon, Miss Boston was sitting in Tilly Droon's little sitting-room, a cup of tea in one hand and a half-eaten bourbon in the other. "Dora's not well," said Tilly. Miss Boston shook her head. "Oh, she always has some illness, or thinks she has. She likes to be fussed over. Where's the news in that?" "But that's just it, Alice. She isn't faking it this time. There really is something wrong with her." Oh, poor Dora. Whatever's the matter? "Grice, her handyman, said it is something to do with her heart." "Oh, dear," tutted Aunt Alice. "We shall have to go round and cheer her up." Tilly banged her fists on the chair arm in frustration, and in doing so knocked a startled Tabby to the floor. "No, no, no," she cried. "That's the point, you see. That's why Grice came and spoke to me. He says Dora's not to have visitors for a few days. That's what she told him to tell us." Tilly leaned forward and lowered her voice. "Thing is, though, Grice wasn't very happy because after telling me that, he said he was to go and fetch Mrs. Cooper. Seems Dora wants to see her. Getting very friendly, those two." Miss Boston's chins wobbled in annoyance. "I think we have been snubbed, Tilly dear," she said, "and I believe Dora will live to regret letting that woman into her house." Jennet had been thinking about the previous night all day long. She could not forget that tragic figure in white pouring out her grief in the churchyard. She hoped the novice would return tonight. There had to be something she could do to help. She had come armed against the pangs of hunger. In one pocket there was a baked potato, and in the other one of Aunt Alice's silver forks. Jennet shivered and decided it was time to eat. A seabird flew overhead and was caught in the beams of the arc lights. Jennet watched it falter and then regain its balance. When she lowered her eyes, something caught her attention. There she was, the sister from the convent. But someone was with her. Jennet reared up a little higher, for she could not quite see the other person. A little more, and there, dressed in black, with her short blonde hair gleaming under the moon, was Rowena Cooper. Jennet had never met the woman before, but Aunt Alice had given her a perfect description. It could be no other. Jennet was fascinated. All her instincts warned her, and tiny alarm signals jangled in her head, but she had to find out what was going on. Ignoring her better judgment, she crawled through the grass and drew closer. Ben trudged to the bridge, yawning and stumbling. Another evening had gone by, and there was still no sign of the moon kelp. The boy was learning a good deal about the fisher folk. Once, while Hesper was telling him about the weather charmers, a salty tear had trickled down her nut-brown cheek. "Una was the mightiest of the weather charmers," she said. "What happened to her?" Ben asked. "It's a pity she isn't here now." Hesper bowed her head and said no more. It was Nelda who explained to him. "But if Una were here," she said, "then there would be no need to find the moon kelp. For it was she who fell in love with the fisherman and bore the half-child. It is through her that we are all accursed." Ben's head spun with all he had learnt. He was too tired to take most of it in, and his feet dragged beneath him as he walked back through the town. Glancing back to the shore, he froze and stared keenly through the gloom. A figure was crouching on the sands. Although it was dark, it was unmistakably an Aufwader. Yet it was obviously neither Nelda or Hesper. Excitedly, the boy hurried down onto the beach to meet him.
Gah!
spat the guttural voice of the stranger as a wave rushed in and covered his feet. Ben didn't like the sound of him. He stopped in his tracks and prepared to turn back, but it was too late. The Aufwader spun round and saw the boy. He was an ugly character. A great sneer scarred his face, and his large ears were ragged and torn from many fights. Even in the dim light of the street lamps, Ben could recognize the pattern on the Gansey. It was the same as Nelda's. The evil-looking creature was her father. The Aufwader opened his wrinkled, tobacco-stained mouth and hissed,
"A human whelp with a sight, is it?"
The creature took a sharp knife from his belt and held it up to the boy's face.
"Come to pry again, have you, land breed?"
The deadly blade touched Ben's cheek, and he shuddered with fear. Then Ben remembered his experience in the Hawthorns, when he had gone upstairs to find Eurydice. He was now facing the thing that had dropped from the opening to the attic.
"I don't like being seen by maggots like you," snapped the creature. "And to make sure you won't never make that mistake again, I'm going to poke those charmed little eyeballs out for you."
The glittering blade slid down.
"Deep stammer!"
bellowed the Aufwader suddenly. His blow went astray, and he turned his head toward the cliff, apparently having heard something that Ben had not. Ben seized his chance. He kicked the Aufwader in the stomach, and its knife spun through the air as the creature doubled up in agony. Grabbing a handful of sand, the boy flung it into his opponent's face. Then he scrambled back over the beach for dear life and did not stop until he was safely indoors and in a startled Aunt Alice's arms. Jennet squashed herself against the headstone and listened. "I can help you," said the voice of Rowena Cooper. "I know why you ache for the water, and why you dare not go near it. Tell me where I may find that which I seek, and we shall both profit by it." "There is nothing you can give me," replied the novice coldly. "I must live with my sins." Rowena twisted her lip in scorn and shook the novice's wrist harshly. "Tell me what I want to know, or I shall be compelled to force you." The novice pulled her arm back sharply, throwing Rowena off balance and making her tumble backwards. Released from the iron grip, the sister fled away past the church and down the steps. At that precise moment, Rowena looked round and her sharp eyes caught sight of Jennet's head peering around a tombstone.
"Who's there?"
she screamed furiously. Jennet did not stay to tell her. Like a hare, she leapt over the graves and charged towards the steps. Suddenly, a terrible howl rent the air. Jennet breathed faster as the sound of her nightmares thundered through the darkness. "Oh, no, no!" Jennet muttered to herself. "This isn't happening. It can't be happening." She hurled herself forward, but in her fear the headstone seemed to rear up before her, barring her way to the steps. To her horror, Jennet saw two gleaming red eyes appear in the deep dark ahead. The full glare of their malice was focused on her, and she felt faint at their baleful stare. It was the worst moment of her life. Her heart leapt into her mouth. The enormous black hound bared its teeth, and its growl rumbled like an earthquake through the cliff. It shifted its weight from paw to paw and tensed itself. Then it sprang. Jennet screamed as loudly as she could. The beast slammed into her, and she was thrust backwards over a gravestone. The hound lowered its head, and the hellish eyes burned into her. Hot breath steamed down onto her face as the hound snapped its frothing jaws together. Jennet waited for the end, and her fists uncurled. Something cold and metal touched her outstretched fingers. It was the fork which had fallen out of her pocket. The hound had reared its head and opened a slavering mouth as it lunged for her neck. Jennet swung her arm up and stabbed the fork into its jowls, ramming it in as far as she could. The reaction was incredible. The beast yelped and fell back, lurching awkwardly and yammering in pain. It spun round, whining in agony and pawing at its cheek till the fork fell to the ground. As soon as it was free, the hound leapt away and disappeared into the darkness, yelping madly as it went. Shaken, Jennet got to her feet. On the ground, the fork burst into blue flames and vanished. The girl tore to the steps and ran home. Ben and Jennet sat on the sofa in Aunt Alice's cosy parlour. The old lady stood in front of the fireplace with her hands clasped behind her back. She had dressed the girls' cuts and bruises and given them both a hot cup of tea with biscuits. When she had made sure they were both comfortable, she made them tell her exactly what happened. When their stories were over, Aunt Alice cleared her throat and rocked on her heels. "A most perilous time you pair have had. I must say that I am rather disappointed in you both for having kept these things to yourselves." A little while later, Miss Boston tucked Ben into bed. She was dying to learn more about the fisher folk and their way of life, but that would have to wait until another time. "Sleep well, Benjamin," she said softly before closing the door. "Dream not of darkness." With that she made a curious sign in the air, which she repeated outside Jennet's room. Later that night, on the outskirts of Whitby, mysterious lights flickered behind the windows of Mrs. Banbury Scott's grand house, and a foul smell laced the air. A terrible series of crashes and bangs rang through the old building, but in her pink chiffon-curtained bed, Mrs. Banbury Scott slept soundly. The children had the afternoon to themselves. It was a bright, warm day, and Jennet was glad to feel the sun on her face. The dark horrors of the night seemed an age away. She and Ben were together in Whitby, and that was all that mattered. They went together to visit the lifeboat museum. It was contained in one large room. Ben moved round the cases. He longed to be able to make a model ship like one of these, and dawdled past each and every display. Just when he thought he had finished, something else grabbed his attention. The exhibit was like no other. It was a large stump of wood, which, when Ben drew closer, he could see had been carved. But the sculpture was an alarming piece of art. Drowning men floundered amid wooden waves, whilst above them a capsized lifeboat rode the churning sea. Ben shivered when he saw the terrified faces of the lifeboatmen. "'Tain't pretty, is it, lad?" said a voice. Ben turned round. A red-faced, stout man with white hair was standing behind him. "It shows the lifeboat disaster of 1861, said the stranger. He crouched down to the boy's level and pointed at the carved, curling waves. "It were a bit of February, and a raw gale had been blasting in nigh on a week. 3 times the lifeboat was launched that day, battling into the storm-mad waters, defying the devil's tempest. 3 times the lifeboat returned, safe with the rescued crews of the dying ships. In the afternoon, the schooner Merchant was hurled ashore. Tired from their earlier valiant efforts, the lifeboatmen doggedly launched their rescue boat for the 4th time. The gale ravaged down and the sea rose against them. 2 great waves collided beneath the boat, overturning it and throwing the crew into the seething waters." The man put his hand on Ben's shoulder and whispered somberly, "Of 13 souls that set out in that lifeboat, only 1 came back." Ben thought how horrible it must be to feel the freezing water fill your ears and close over your head. He drew his breath in sharply. Jennet had been watching all of this. She smiled to herself and silently crept up behind her brother. "Boo!" she shouted. Ben jumped. "That's not funny!" he yelled. "Just you wait till I catch you!" Jennet ran laughing out of the museum. Miss Boston sat back in the pew and closed her hymn book. Jerusalem had always been a favourite of Prudence's. She wiped a tear from her eye and bowed her head in silent prayer. "Oh," whined Mrs. Banbury Scott. It's too much. I just can't bear it." She put a hand to her chest and her lips trembled. It had been a dreadful day for her, starting with waking up from that unpleasantly heavy sleep and discovering that her house had been ransacked. She did not feel at all well. The stress was tremendous, and her face looked ill even through the thick layers of makeup. Rowena Cooper bent her head and pretended to mourn for Prudence Joyster. She even managed to squeeze out a solitary tear. For the first time that afternoon, Miss Boston managed to get a good look at the woman. She rubbed her eyes and looked again. On Rowena's cheek, something was faintly shimmering. Miss Boston squinted at the hazy blur, which seemed to be some sort of scar. She sucked her teeth and nodded to herself. That was no ordinary mark, and she knew that nobody else present would be able to see it. "Help!" croaked Mrs. Banbury-Scott, throwing off her furs and bending double with pain. "Dora!" cried Rowena smartly. "What is it?" "Let me through! Let me through!" called Dr. Adams. Everyone watched him ease the fat woman onto the floor, where he banged her chest with his fists. Aunt Alice shook her head in disbelief as Mrs. Banbury-Scott gasped like a fish out of water. An expression of genuine concern crossed Rowena's face, but that was soon dispelled when Dr. Adams raised his head and said slowly, "I'm sorry. She's gone." A week had passed since the sudden death of Mrs. Banbury-Scott. She had no relatives, so the bulk of her estate was to be divided among the various charities she was fond of. What surprised most people, though, was that she had left her house and its entire contents to Rowena Cooper. Miss Boston felt useless. First Prudence, and now Dora. She was sure that Rowena had had a hand in both deaths. "Oh, if only I had proof of some sort," she grumbled. "But where am I to get it?" "I was wondering if I might have a word with one of the novices here," Miss Boston asked. "But of course," the Mother Superior replied. "That is, if I can find her. Which one is it?" Miss Boston gave an awkward cough. This was the difficult part. She had no idea who Jennet had seen on the cliff. "I believe you have a novice staying with you who is not of your order," she said. "Would I be right in assuming that she has not been here very long?" The nun pushed herself away from the desk and looked at the old lady warily. "Yes, there is one newly come amongst us," she answered in a cautious voice. "Sister Bridget. She is a timid and frightened creature," she continued softly. "I took her in because she needed my help. She has always needed our help." "Always? Has she been here before?" asked Miss Boston. "Sister Bridget once lived in this convent, though long before I came here." "You've been here for 40 years, Miss Boston exclaimed. "Yes," smiled the small, bespectacled woman, "but our records mention her. Our files date back to 1738, and in the earliest of them, a tattered old thing it is too, Sister Bridget is mentioned." "But surely it cannot be the same woman." "I am certain that it is," the nun said firmly. "I now know the whole of her tragic story." She shook herself and rose from the seat. "Come, then," she said. "Let's see if we can find her." When they reached the cell of Sister Bridget, the Mother Superior knocked and entered the room beyond. "It's all right, sister," she said reassuringly to the figure in white, who backed away, startled. "There's someone here who would like a word with you, that's all." The novice looked fearfully over the Mother Superior's shoulder to see who the visitor was. When she saw that it was only an old lady, she relaxed, and the haunted look left her face. "May I ask you some questions?" Miss Boston inquired politely. There was no reply. The novice merely stared dumbly at her. "I should like to know why you have come back to Whitby after all this time," continued the old lady. "And I should also like to know what Rowena Cooper has said to you." Again there was nothing, but the novice had tensed on hearing the name. "You see," Miss Boston carried on, "I believe you know who she really is, and what she is looking for." She leaned forward, and the loose flesh under her chin quivered with passion. "Rowena is a dangerous woman. 2 of my friends are already dead. If there is anything you can tell me which will prove her guilt, you cannot withhold it. Rowena must be stopped before anyone else perishes." The novice lowered her eyes. "I cannot help you," she said quietly. "There is no such word as cannot," Aunt Alice retorted. "I hope you can live with yourself when all is done." Miss Droon became aware of a faint scratching sound. It was coming from the front door, and with a scowl she strode into the hall. She knew exactly what the sound was. She opened the door, and sure enough, there was Eurydice. "You wicked thing!" Tilly Droon exclaimed. "Just where have you been?" The cat darted between her feet and ran into the sitting-room. She was carrying something in her mouth. "Got you, you little madam," said Miss Droon, reaching for her. But then she noticed the strange object that had fallen to the floor. "What's this?" she murmured, stooping to pick it up. Eurydice's trophy was extremely unusual. It appeared to be a weirdly shaped piece of wood and parchment that had been dipped in wax at one end and set in a small pewter holder at the other. "Where did you find this, you naughty girl?" demanded Tilly Droon. Of course there was no answer. Suddenly Tilly gave a little shriek. "Did you go to Mrs. Cooper's house this afternoon? Is that where you got it? Oh, I must take this back to Mrs. Cooper at once. Maybe I should offer to pay for it. I hope it wasn't too expensive." Wearing her dark blue, cat-haired sweater, Miss Droon ran out of the house and made for the 199 steps. The hawthorns looked blank and dreary as she approached. She pattered round to the kitchen door and knocked loudly, waited for a minute or so, and then knocked again. She took the object out from beneath her sweater and tutted at the fluff which was now stuck to it. Expecting Rowena Cooper to open the door at any moment, she began picking the fluff off it. Then it happened. As she stuck her nails into the wax to remove a stubborn, hairy bundle, she pulled too hard. There was a brittle snap, and a large fragment flew over the garden fence. "Blast!" she yelped. "What have I done?" She brought the thing up to her face and lifted the black-rimmed spectacles off her nose to get a better look at the damage. Tilly nearly screamed as she recognized the foul thing in her hand. The object Eurydice had brought out of Rowena Cooper's house was the stolen hand of glory. There was very little of it left. Most of the fingers were missing, and it was almost unrecognizable. With a sickening shock, Miss Droon realized that it must have been used. She remembered how Mrs. Banbury Scott's house had been ransacked the night before her death. No one had heard a thing, and this grisly charm was the reason why. She threw it down in disgust and glanced nervously at the kitchen door. "My God!" she breathed. "It was Rowena!" Tilly stumbled down the lane, horrified at the sudden revelation. At the hawthorns, a short figure with an evil, leering face slipped out of the kitchen and hurried after the elderly woman. Miss Droon halted, turned her head and listened. Above the heaving of her breath, a plaintive whine echoed down the street. Tilly uttered a cry of pity. It was Eurydice. Somewhere her beloved Eurydice was suffering. On she sped towards that hideous screech, down the narrow street which ended at the cliff edge. Nothing could hold her back from finding Eurydice, not even the wire fence which prevented the unwary tourist from straying too near the sheer drop. "Eurydice!" she called. "Eurydice!" But there was no answer. Tilly felt ill, and the strength left her legs. Her sobs choked her as she plucked up enough courage to peer over the edge, preparing herself for the distant sight of a small, furry body floating on the water. "No!" she screamed. Directly beneath her, clinging to the vertical cliff face like a spider on a wall, was Rowena Cooper. Tilly stared, stricken with horror. Rowena threw back her head and looked up. "Meow!" she cried mockingly, and the voice was identical to Eurydice's. Rowena had impersonated her to lure Miss Droon to the cliff's edge. But why? Even as the question formed in Tilly's mind, Rowena scuttled up the sheer cliff and stretched out a claw-like hand. She grabbed Tilly's ankle and gripped it fiercely. Tilly's leg was snatched from under her, and with a last shriek she toppled over the cliff and plummeted downwards. It had been a sad, quiet day. They had heard the tragic news about Miss Droon the first thing that morning, and Aunt Alice had wept a great deal. With a sigh, Jennet sat back in an armchair and picked up a book. The hours passed slowly. She stifled several yawns and tried to keep awake. Wearily she flicked through the book's pages, skipping over Whitby's whaling days and a horrible account of the lifeboat disaster. A small passage told her how the abbey had been damaged in the First World War by 2 German cruisers that opened fire on the town, but there were no pictures to enliven the dreary text, and Jennet's eyelids slid heavily down. Then, with a jolt, she snapped awake. She looked at the grandfather clock. She had been asleep for nearly 2 hours. She ran up to Ben's bedroom and flung open the door. It was empty. "He must have gone out when I was asleep," she told herself. "Just wait till I catch him." Jennet charged down the stairs, plucked her coat off the hanger, and dashed out of the front door. What if her brother had met that evil Aufwader again? She raised her head to look at the floodlit ruins of the abbey and the squat shape of the church. Then she blinked and looked again. In the cemetery stood a shining white figure whose robes blazed like flames. Sister Bridget was deliberately standing in front of the arc lights. The distant, radiant figure stretched out her arms. "She's beckoning to me," Jennet murmured in astonishment. "Perhaps she knows what happened to Ben." Jennet tried to forget the terror she had felt the last time she had gone to the churchyard in the dark, but the image of the hound as it pounced on her was ingrained in her mind, and the nearer she drew to the 199 steps, the clearer the memory became. "Where's the fire?" demanded a voice. The girl turned round, and there was Aunt Alice. Jennet was so relieved to see her that she threw her arms about the old lady's neck. "Ben's missing," she said quickly. "I looked for him, and then I saw the novice. She was standing right in front of the lights, and I'd swear she was beckoning to me." Miss Boston frowned and looked up the steps. "Most peculiar," she said. "I wonder if she has changed her mind. Come, let us see if she can throw any light on Benjamin's whereabouts." Sister Bridget was looking straight at them. Her hands were clasped tightly before her, and the look of worry on her face lifted only momentarily at the sight of them. "I must talk with you," Sister Bridget told them urgently. "Do I take it that you have changed your mind?" asked Miss Boston. The sister nodded. "You were right. Forgive me. When I heard about the death of your friend, I knew I could keep silent no longer. Beware of Rowena Cooper. I have looked into her heart and found it black and rotten, while pure evil courses in her veins. She has transcended her human flesh and surrendered humanity to the powers of the dark." Aunt Alice touched Sister Bridget's downcast face and asked, "How long have you hidden yourself away, little one? How many years have you wept alone? A convent is no place for a child to grow up. What a wretched life you have led." A tear sparkled on the novice's cheek, and she hastily wiped it away. "Then you do know my history," she said. "Who told you?" "Well, I confess that Benjamin told me some of it. I guessed the rest." "Benjamin?" repeated Sister Bridget. "That is the boy's name. He searches with the Aufwaders along the shore, does he not?" He consorts freely with the fisher folk now. Was all my suffering in vain?" Jennet did not understand. Did Sister Bridget have the sight too? "What do you know about my brother?" she asked. "Have you seen him tonight? Is he with those things again?" The corners of Sister Bridget's mouth twitched into a slight smile. "I do not know where your brother is," she said, "but the time has come to cast aside all pretence." Miss Boston put her arm round Jennet and drew her back a little. The novice raised her hands and methodically removed the pins which kept the white veil in place. She threw them to the ground, and with a great glad sigh she tore the veil from her head. The hair which she shook loose was a thick tangle of dark green that grew far back on the top of her head. She swept the heavy seaweed-like hanks over her shoulders, and as she did so, Jennet saw the scales behind her scalloped ears glisten in the moonlight. You're not human," she stammered. "I stand before you the first and last of my kind," Bridget told her. "My father was a fisherman, a good soul, yet cursed with the sight. Cursed because it ruined his life. He saw and fell in love with an Aufwader, and together they defied the wishes of the lords of the deep." She turned and stared out to the calm black sea. "I was the result of their union," she said. "The sin of my parents was borne out in me. A freak of nature I am, a hideous crossbreed that should never have been allowed to draw breath." "Well, I think you look marvellous," piped up Aunt Alice, unable to conceal her enthusiasm any longer. The novice shrugged. "Then you are the only one," she said. "Even Una, my mother, could not bear to see me once my father was taken to the deeps. It was she who entrusted me to the care of the nuns, leaving me outside the convent gates as an infant." Jennet felt her eyes prick with tears. She felt so awful about calling the Aufwaders things. "How well I know the sights and smells of the sea," Sister Bridget continued. "How many times have I watched it, that slumbering beast that waits for me? I fear that one day soon I may walk into the water and not return. No one would mourn my going, and the deep ones will rise to drag me to their dark realm." Aunt Alice touched her hand sympathetically, but it was not pity that Sister Bridget wanted. "I have dared all to bring you here tonight," she said. "Now that I have surrendered my secret, the number of my days is short. But before I take the cold road, I must make sure that Rowena Cooper is thwarted." Aunt Alice held Jennet tightly. "And what did she ask?" she ventured. The sister fanned out her fingers and spread her hands before her, motioning to the invisible horizon of the sea. "She seeks the moon kelp," she answered simply. "But that's what Ben's looking for," exclaimed Jennet. "He said it was to save the Aufwader tribe. What can she want it for?" "The moon kelp is a great treasure," returned Sister Bridget. "The lords of the deep would pay anything in their power to get it back. Rowena undoubtedly has a deadlier prize in mind than the lifting of the mother's curse." Miss Boston peered at the novice with twinkling eyes. Quietly she said, "You know when and where it will bloom, don't you?" "Yes," she said. "See how the moon rides full in the sky. Soon it will be at its height, and then we must be ready. The treasure of the deep ones blooms tonight." For a moment Jennet and Miss Boston were speechless. "Tonight," the old lady repeated eventually. "Gracious, what can we do?" "We must claim the wish and lift the mother's curse. That way Rowena will never achieve her goal. Come, we dare not delay any longer, for the moon kelp will not wait. Ben's feet were soaked, so he sat down on the sand and emptied the water from his shoes. A great silver road shimmered and sparkled over the sea. The gentle waves absorbed the light, and as they broke against the land, the moonbeams fractured and scattered 1,000,000 pearls in the air. Ben was enthralled, and stared breathlessly at the moon. The enchanted light glimmered on his face. Then, through the sighing rush of the sea, another sound began. It was the sweetest music he had ever heard, and he looked round to see where it was coming from. Abruptly the sound was snatched away and the light was extinguished. Slowly the boy began to realize what was happening. The light and the music had been a signal, like a herald's fanfare of trumpets. The time had come. The moon kelp was in bloom. With a yell, Ben jumped up and down and danced on the sand. "Once in 900 years, Hesper said, and that was tonight." He began to run over the sand. There was only one thing to do. The Aufwaders must be told, and that meant venturing into their caves, ignoring every warning. Desperately he stormed across the harbour. He felt ready to burst as he scrambled down the old stone wall and dropped onto the flat, slippery rock below. The sea had not yet flooded the shore beneath the cliff face, but already its creeping outriders were filling the rock pools. "Nelda! Where are you? Hesper, can you hear me?" Only the incoming sea answered him. Ben whirled round and to his horror saw that the way back was totally cut off. The path was now flooded. He was trapped. "Help!" came his pitiful shouts. "Nelda! Hesper! It's Ben! Help me!" Ben stood on a tiny island of rock, but it was rapidly shrinking. One big wave was all it would take to sweep him off and drag him under. Suddenly the cliff trembled. A loud cracking and grinding issued from the darkness above, and a shower of small pebbles rattled down. The door to the Aufwader cave was opening. A familiar voice called, "Ben! Take my hand!" It was Nelda. Ben reached up and clasped the small Aufwader's hand. Then, helped by her aunt, she began to haul him up. Ben staggered to his feet. "It's the moon kelp! It's time!" Hesper stared at her niece and let loose a terrific hoot of happiness. "Oh, it's true, after all," she cheered. "It's true, it's true! Una was right!" Hesper ran to a row of boats and dragged one to the doorway. Ben and Nelda put all their weight behind the small boat. Lurching, it slid off the ledge and flew through the air, landing with a great smack on the water. Expertly, Hesper hopped into the tiny craft and brought it as close to the threshold as the current permitted. "You next, boy," she called. "All you have to do is step down. Do not be alarmed. It's perfectly safe." Taking a deep breath in case he fell into the water, Ben stepped out. With a bump, he found himself sprawled in the boat at Hesper's feet. He pulled himself up gingerly as the vessel tilted from side to side. On the threshold of the ledge, Nelda faltered as the fisherfolk poured in. There were 35 of them, the sole survivors of the Aufwader race. Through the assembled fisherfolk moved a single figure, Esau, the oldest of the ruling triad. He raised his wizened arm and pointed an accusing finger at Nelda. "Treachery!" his old voice cracked. "Thou art a traitor to thy kind! Henceforth the line of tar is banished from this place. Let no one give them aid. Ye have consorted with the land breed." "Be silent, you old fool!" Nelda shouted defiantly. "Tonight the moon kelp blooms, and when we find it, the curse of the deep ones will be lifted forever." Esau glared at her.
And then he relaxed and said with a shrewd smile, "Very well, child. If thou do indeed bring back the treasure of the deep ones, then I shall lift my judgment. But if they return empty-handed, then expect the full measure of my wrath, and abide by my decision."
"So be it," agreed Nelda, and with that she leapt off the threshold. Sister Bridget was staring out beyond the harbour entrance towards the horizon. Miss Boston followed her gaze. Something was slowly moving across the water. It was a strange, hazy sight, and she wished she had brought her binoculars with her. Jennet also looked, but although her vision was stronger than Aunt Alice's, it was not as sensitive. What she saw made her shake her head and look again. It appeared to be a small figure hovering over the surface of the sea. Jennet was taken aback, but when she turned her eyes upon it a second time, she saw that the figure was actually sitting in a little boat. "It is an off-wader vessel," said Sister Bridget unexpectedly. "I see two of their folk. One wears an oilskin hat, the other is younger, and beside her there is a human child." "Is it Ben?" asked Jennet. The novice nodded. "Yes," she confirmed. "It is your brother. They are searching for the moon kelp. They will never find it without my guidance."
"We must attract their attention," said Miss Boston excitedly. "Jump up and down, Jennet dear," she cried desperately. "They must see us."
Gradually, the small Aufwader vessel came closer. It was Hesper who had seen them, and she gazed curiously at the tall figure dressed in white. Jennet had watched the approaching boat with mounting concern. The poor girl could not see the Aufwaders at all. The only things real to her were Ben and the boat. She had no idea how the vessel was being steered or how the oars moved through the water. Her brother looked up and waved at her cheerfully. "Just you wait," she muttered under her breath. "I'll teach you to run off like that." Nelda looked at the novice and immediately saw the faint shimmering aura that surrounded her. Confused, she turned to her aunt for an answer to this riddle.
"Behold the daughter of Una," Hesper announced.
The oars dipped into the sea, and swiftly Nelda brought the boat alongside the pier.
"Delighted to meet you," chatted Miss Boston as Hesper climbed up beside her.
"Only an hour remains," said Sister Bridget. "I must take your place in the boat." She brushed past Hesper and began to climb down the ladder, glancing at the deep water and shuddering. Nelda and Ben stared at her in surprise. "Are you really the daughter of Una?" asked Nelda. "For my sins," she returned solemnly. "Now hold the craft steady and make room for me. Hurry, child. I shall be your guide now." Nelda put the oars into the water and struggled to pull away from the pier. Hesper stamped her foot with irritation.
"All this time I've wandered the shores to find it," she snorted. "Now I shall never see the moon kelp."
They watched the little craft move away, so engrossed that they failed to hear the footsteps which approached from behind. The woman was dressed in black robes, which were tied round her middle by a thick purple cord. On a chain round her neck she wore a 5-pointed star that gleamed against the midnight material.
"I do believe that Mrs. Cooper is showing her true colours at last. What do you think, Jennet? A little too crude for my taste, perhaps, but then what can one expect from a black witch?" said Miss Boston.
"A witch?" repeated Jennet, and she gaped at Rowena.
Miss Boston folded her arms. "Oh, yes," she said. "Mrs. Cooper, though I doubt if that is her real name, has been using her treacherous arts from the moment she arrived."
Rowena sneered at her and moved a little closer. She was now effectively blocking the way back, and they were caught between her and the end of the pier. She glared at the horizon, the boat now only a small speck upon it, and tossed her head with anger.
"They are out of your reach now," smiled Miss Boston blithely.
Rowena hissed venomously at her.
"You old crone! I'm not defeated yet! Gull!" she shrieked. "Come here, Gull!"
Hesper clutched her hat anxiously. With wide eyes she watched as a short figure hurried along the pier towards them. It was the leering, dark Aufwader. Knife in hand, he ran to Rowena's side and licked his brown teeth. He shot a despising glance at Hesper and wiped his nose on his sleeve. Hesper's heart grew cold.
"Hello, Silas," she said eventually. "I thought you were dead." "Hoped I was, you mean," he laughed. "But that's what I wanted you to think."
Hesper looked at his Gansey. It belonged to Nelda's father.
"Never was there a more loathsome worm," she said. "I curse the day I wed you, Silas Gull." "Listen to this, Hesper, my love. If I had the chance, I would gladly have throttled your holy brother 9 times over."
Hesper flew at him. Whipping out one of her little fishing poles, she beat Silas on the side of his head. Silas fell back, but immediately sprang to his feet and flourished the knife before him.
"Enough!"
snapped Rowena suddenly. "Out there, that half-breed could be claiming the wish. You must stop her."
"What do you expect me to do?" he asked. "We ain't got no boat, have we?"
"You can swim, can't you?" Rowena snarled back at him. Silas stared at the black, uninviting water and shivered.
"I'm not going in there," he said firmly. "You will do precisely what I command," shouted Rowena, grabbing him by the scruff of the neck.
With a fierce push, she thrust him over the edge and he tumbled into the sea.
"Bring the moon kelp back to me!" she called down to him.
Swearing and grumbling under his breath, Silas kicked his legs in the water and began to swim after the little boat. Hesper looked questioningly at Aunt Alice. "But why should this human desire the moon kelp?" she asked. Rowena's thin, twisted lips pulled wide apart and revealed all her teeth.
"The moon kelp is not my goal," she told them. "Once I return the wretched moon kelp to the lords of the deep, I shall have it. The power to control and destroy will be mine alone to wield. The lords of the deep know the precise location of what I seek. Somewhere in this squalid, dingy little town, a most wondrous thing was hidden and forgotten many ages past. An artifact charged with the magic of the ancients." "Balderdash!" retorted Miss Boston. "Whitby is full of legends, but I've never heard anything to suggest that before. Absolute rubbish."
Rowena prowled before her, and the old lady teetered on the brink of the pier.
"Have you not?" she growled with menace. "What of Saint Hilda?" scoffed Rowena. "Before she came here, Hilda was a sorceress. If she had not found your god, she could have ruled absolutely with the power that she possessed."
Miss Boston uttered a cry as finally it came to her.
"And she cut off the heads of the serpent," she said, fearfully repeating the old legend, "with a whip or staff."
The old lady glanced at Rowena and trembled, momentarily losing her balance.
"Can it be true?" she stammered.
Rowena Cooper swept the short bleached curls off her forehead. Forming her bloodless lips into a horrible smile, she laughed softly and murmured, "Yes, tonight the staff of Hilda will be mine." Nelda ceased rowing, for her arms were tired. She gazed about them, but all was dark. Not a sign of the moon kelp anywhere. The novice caught her doubtful glance. "Patience," she told her. "The moon kelp will not show itself until I speak the charm of the cold realm." She put her hands together and rested her chin upon them. Then, quietly at first, she began to recite the words her mother had sung to her. A faint glimmer appeared about the boat. Ben and Nelda looked at each other in wonder as sparks danced over its timbers. The shining water crackled, and a flash of green lightning streaked through the waves, encircling them in a mesh of magical fire which radiated outwards, weaving a dazzling net upon the calm sea. Abruptly, Sister Bridget stopped chanting. She collapsed into Nelda's arms, gasping for breath. Her work was done. From the deep, empty reaches of the seabed, the moon kelp rose. Beneath the silver sea, a rich yellow glow welled up. Bubbles of flame erupted on the surface and burst against the keel of the Aufwader vessel. With a hiss of steam, the treasure of the Deep One surged upwards and met the air. Ben fell back at the incredible sight. The many strands of the moon kelp shone gold and green. The light which pulsed from them was like midday at high summer, and it laced the surrounding sea. "Hurry!" Nelda instructed Ben. "Gather it before it sinks again." Ben reached over the side and put his hands into the water. It was deliciously warm, and when his fingers brushed the waving weed, all weariness left him. Quickly the boy began to haul the moon kelp out of the sea. Fiery jewels dripped from it. The marvellous light flooded his face when he held the treasure in his hands, and the boat brimmed over with its glory. Sister Bridget stirred in Nelda's arms. "Send it back to them," she said urgently. "Claim the reward and release your people." Nelda could not quite believe what was happening. She felt as though she was inside one of the old legends Hesper had told her. Hastily she foraged in the canvas bag by her side and brought out a large scallop shell. "Place it on this," she told Ben. "I must call to the Deep Ones and dispatch their treasure." The boat tipped suddenly. Ben was thrown to one side and the novice screamed. Terrified in case they fell into the water, she gripped the sides and sobbed with fear. Above her frantic cries, a harsh voice said, "May the deep swallow that lot of yours!" Ben stared at Silas fearfully. "I thought this was your father," he told Nelda. "No," she muttered tearfully. "He is my uncle and a murderer." "Shut your whining!" Silas roared, and his rough hand snaked out and struck the side of her face. Sister Bridget, petrified with horror, could do nothing to prevent Silas from reaching in to snatch the moon kelp away. Anger to the point of madness furied up inside Nelda. Still stinging from his blow, she lashed out at her evil uncle. "You killed my father!" she screamed. Lunging at the hand which held the moon kelp, she seized it in her own, bared her teeth, and bit deeply into his skin. "Ah!" he screeched, tearing his hand from her mouth. "You've drawn blood!" he yelled, gazing at the torn flesh. "Well, you'll not do that again!" With his other hand he punched his niece for all he was worth. Nelda reeled backwards, and as she fell her head struck the side of the boat with a dull crack. She slumped senseless to the bottom. Sister Bridget raised her head and glared at Silas reproachfully. He did not notice the perilous look which had crept into her eyes. Very softly she began to hum. Silas sucked the back of his hand and eased himself back into the water. It was time to return to Rowena. Keeping the glowing moon kelp over his head, Silas pushed himself away from the boat and began swimming to the far shore. Almost imperceptibly, words began to creep into Sister Bridget's tune. It grew stronger until she was singing loud and defiantly. Suddenly the melody changed. The tone became harsh and prickled the hairs on Ben's neck. The wind now blew in strong gusts that whipped the waves and crowned them with foam. The boat spun round as the breakers smashed into its side. Ben stared at Sister Bridget. Somehow she was responsible for this. The waves swelled all the more. Huge volumes of water reared up and raged towards Silas. The Aufwader cried out, but his voice was lost amid the tumult as the hammering waves swept him up, then hurled him down again. Silas sought to keep afloat with the moon kelp above his head. With one final shriek that seemed to madden the wild blasting gale, Sister Bridget stopped. "Take the oars!" she shouted to Ben. "You have to row to him!" They rowed the boiling sea, skimming bravely between the steep water valleys, gaining with every dreadful moment upon the toiling figure of Silas. Sister Bridget stretched out her hand. "I have it!" she shouted as her fingers closed about the moon kelp in Silas's clutches. She sat back in the boat and waved the shining treasure over her head. "At last!" she cried triumphantly. Ben cheered with relief, but he turned guiltily to the Aufwader still struggling in the water. "Help!" spluttered Silas. "I'm drowning!" Ben glanced at the novice. "We can't leave him," he said. Sister Bridget looked at the boat uncertainly. It wasn't big enough for 4 of them. Silas would just have to hang on to the side. "Here," she said to the boy, "take the moon kelp. I shall pull him from the water." Silas waved his arms in panic. "Save me!" he gargled. "I'm done for!" "Take my hand!" called the novice, stretching out as far as she dared. Silas reached up and grabbed the offered hand. "Gotcha now, half-breed!" he snarled, dropping the pretense. Too late, Sister Bridget realized she had been tricked. "No!" she pleaded. "I beg you!" But it was no good. Using his last reserve of strength, the Aufwader dragged her out of the boat. "Time to come home!" he yelled as she fell into the sea. A great spout of water flew up when she hit the seething waves. A change came over the blackened sea. Far below, a sickly greenish light began to pulse, as if her presence in the water had triggered some strange alarm. From the fathomless depths, a great bell began to toll. Sister Bridget wailed when she heard it, and her tears mingled with the sea. Ben put down the oars and stared at the horizon. In the dim distance there rose an immense wall of water in a thunderous rush. It reached into the night sky, and savage lightning flickered round its towering height. It was like a mountain of glass that fed on the surrounding darkness, sucking up the sea and ever increasing in size. Sister Bridget knew she faced death. All those years of cringing from the world were finally over. The wrathful lords of the deep had found her, just as they had found her father, and they had come to claim her. It was the end of everything. She sobbed hopelessly. Had it all been for nothing? Silas swung one leg over the side of the boat, but the other leg refused to follow. In fact, it pulled him down again. Below him, Sister Bridget laughed. It was a terrible sound, filled with doom and despair. Her hands were fastened about his ankle, and she held on tenaciously. "Come, stunted one," she cried. "Let me embrace you." Just as he had pulled her, she dragged Silas out of the boat. He fell into the water with a great howl of fear. With a fierce light in her eyes, Sister Bridget turned to Ben. "Row, fool!" she shrieked. "Row!" The boy snapped out of his terror and strained at the oars. The novice watched the boat pull away and dragged Silas in the opposite direction. The sheer wall of water towered above them, and within its ominous bulk he saw 3 shadowy figures. The lords of the deep wore crowns of glowing green stars. Their eyes were huge, lidless discs that glared down at Sister Bridget accusingly, and the hair, which cascaded from their bloated, coral-crusted heads, was like the branches of great trees. A deafening thunderclap issued from their mouths, and they revealed row upon row of sharp, jagged teeth. "Take the cold road with me, Silas Gull," the novice hissed in his ear. "Let them drag us down together." With terrible violence, the Deep Ones smashed down on them. The sea convulsed at the impact, and shock waves sped inland and smote the cliffs of Whitby. The Aufwader boat was tossed like a matchstick on the water. On board, Ben clung to Nelda for dear life. In its ruin he had seen monstrous tentacles writhing and thrashing in the wake of the wave. For several minutes he lay shaking on the bottom of the boat. Then it was all over. The sea became calm, and when Ben peered over the side, it was as though nothing had happened. Only the empty sea met his gaze. There was no sign of Sister Bridget or Silas anywhere. On the pier, Aunt Alice squeezed Jennet's hand. They had all seen the terrible wave rise up, but had no idea what was happening. Then the sea flung itself upon the cliff, and fierce waves battered against the pier. Miss Boston took hold of Hesper, and with Jennet pushed past Rowena. They ran to the old lighthouse and clung to its rails as the waves crashed over the edge. While the spray foamed up over the stone, Rowena pressed her fingers to her temples. "I must see," she whispered. "I must know." Locking her muscles until they were rigid, she sent her thoughts flying over the water towards the Aufwader boat. There, Ben was standing in the craft, a brilliant thread of flame scorching upwards from the shell in his hands. The wish was his now. Rowena threw her arms wide and screwed up her face, summoning every ounce of power. "Channel through me, demons that feed off my soul," she cried. "Put my voice in his mouth. Let my word be his, for evil's sake." Nelda grunted. She touched the tender lump on her skull and winced. Very slowly her eyes fluttered open. The world was swirling, and strange voices echoed inside her head. She did not know where she was, but something bright was shining above her, and she blinked to bring everything into focus. The last sparks from the moon kelp drifted up from the shell in Ben's hands, and then she remembered. She realized that she had woken just in time, for the boy was about to lift the curse. At last her tribe would be able to grow, and children would be born again. But the smile froze on her mouth. Something was wrong. The boy looked ill. His face was drawn, and he swayed like one in a trance. "Hear me, ye lords of the deep and dark," he shouted in a voice that sounded forced and unfamiliar. "Reveal unto Rowena Cooper the precise location of Hilda's staff." The shell fell from his hands. It shattered on the side of the boat, and the cloud of ash was snatched away by the breeze. "What have you done?" stammered Nelda. On the pier, Rowena Cooper shuddered. In the far north sky a point of light appeared. A slender shaft of green light slanted down over the sea and shone on the witch's forehead. It burned into her mind the knowledge she so desperately sought, and she crowed with delight. At last she knew! Spinning on her heels, she threw Miss Boston and the others a triumphant glance, then hurried back to the town with her robes billowing behind her. The old shed in the gardens of the late Mrs. Banbury Scott's house was lost in shadow, nestling against the wall. Rowena ran up to it and pushed open the heavy door. She fumbled for a switch and clicked on the electric light. The walls were covered with tools, and on one side there were 3 shelves stacked with tins containing nails and tacks, nuts and bolts, and old bits of wire. "There," she whispered. "The mark of St. Hilda." On the bare wall between 2 of the shelves was a curious sign gouged into the plaster. She seized a pair of garden shears and drove them into the wall. A jagged gash now grinned in the whitewash. With the next strike of the shears, the plaster gave way. A sound like a rifle firing blistered through the hut, and all along the wall hairline cracks appeared. Rowena stood back as the cracks widened, and in an avalanche of dust and dirt the whole lot slid down. When the choking cloud settled, she wiped her eyes and laughed. At her feet, half hidden in the rubble of long-buried centuries, was the staff of Hilda. "Mine," she said softly, as she felt the magic of the ancient surge through her. "It really is mine!" The witch threw back her head and laughed madly. The Aufwader vessel bumped against the side of the pier, and Nelda slowly rowed to the iron rungs. Ben scrambled up the ladder. When he was safely on the pier, he ran to his sister and flung his arms round her. "It's all my fault," he cried. "It's all my fault. I had it in my hands, but instead of asking for the curse to be lifted—" He was too ashamed to complete the sentence. "Then what did you ask for?" cried Hesper angrily. Ben felt rotten. "I'm not really sure," he mumbled feebly. "Not sure?" shouted Hesper. "How can you be not sure? Are you a total simpleton, boy? The moon kelp was our only chance. Have you doomed us to extinction, human?" Miss Boston covered her face. "Of course," she groaned. "Rowena, I thought she looked too happy. Ben was a victim of her devilish arts." She laid her hands on the boy's shoulders and looked him squarely in the face. "Tell me, Benjamin," she begged, "what was it you asked for? Was it for the whereabouts of Hilda's staff to be revealed to Mrs. Cooper?" "How did you know?" he asked. Miss Boston groaned. "Then we have all failed," she said. "If the staff is as powerful as Rowena believes it to be, nothing can stand in her way." Suddenly, Nelda cried out. "Look!" she shouted, pointing to the church. Miss Boston, Hesper and Ben turned and fixed their eyes upon the floodlit building. Standing before the arc lights, as Sister Bridget had done hours earlier, was Rowena Cooper, and the staff of Hilda was in her hands. Even from that distance they heard her harsh, gloating laughter. Rowena was insane with joy, and she revelled in the new-found strength which flowed through her veins. Whitby flickered beneath the flashes of darkness that issued from Hilda's staff. The very fabric of the night seemed to swirl over the rooftops, and the heavens were alive with black thunderbolts. The tombstones blistered, and the moss fell from them as the ancient magic passed over. The weathered inscriptions glowed with purple fire, until they were as clear and sharp as the day they were first carved. Still the staff poured out its might. The solid, immovable shape of St. Mary's quivered as the coils of blackness pounded its walls, and the years fell away from it. Close by, the majestic ruin of the abbey shimmered, and its ragged walls switched in and out of past ages. For an instant it was the grand structure it had once been, whole and with light shining through its high stained-glass windows, and the next it was partially built. Then it disappeared entirely, replaced by a collection of smaller buildings. Rowena was unravelling time. "Rowena is dragging Whitby back through its own history," said Aunt Alice. "But this is only the beginning. If she is not stopped, then everywhere will be plunged into chaos." The old lady held onto her hat and darted over the beach. "We must take that staff from her," she told them, "whatever the cost." Rowena's glittering eyes swivelled from the barren marshland to the rapidly shrinking piers and along the wide expanse of cliff. There her gaze was arrested as it fixed upon the 5 figures that toiled up the steps. She regarded them as she might a collection of insects.
"Futile creatures," the witch spat. "Perhaps I could have some sport with them."
Filled with evil purpose, she raised the staff and pointed it at Ben and Nelda. A twisting jet of power streamed down from the staff and cannoned into them with staggering force. They were plucked off the steps and swept into the air. With a flash of purple fire they were sucked into its spinning centre, and their cries were swallowed by the night. On the steps beneath, Jennet staggered to a halt. The maelstrom crackled and spun towards her. Jennet clung to the railing as the gale lifted her off the ground, and the spiralling maw of night closed on her. She felt her fingers slip from the rail, then with one final cry, was lost. The sound of Rowena's laughter broke into the night.
"You fool!" she cried. "See how easily I vanquish you!"
From out of a shimmering rent in the fragmented heavens, there suddenly came a fierce burst of gunfire. Above the valley 2 aircraft appeared, locked in combat, their engines roaring in the shredded clouds. Miss Boston looked up incredulously. "Good Lord!" she muttered. The planes swooped low over the cliffs. Hugging the ground, they zoomed perilously close to Aunt Alice and Hesper, and a blizzard of lead hailed from their spluttering guns. One of the planes bore a swastika. They were witnessing the dogfight which had taken place over the rooftops of Whitby during the Second World War. Rowena had snatched the planes out of time to fight again. "She's toying with us," declared the old lady, "using history itself to do her dirty work." The creeping darkness that had swiftly consumed Whitby finally reached them. Boiling mud bubbled up through the cracks in the stonework, and the steps sank into a mire of soft clay. Before they had a chance to escape, the ravenous time flow devoured them. Everything was dark. Sleet hammered into Ben's face, driven by a savage northeasterly gale. The freezing air hurt his lungs. His mind was reeling. Where was he? He shivered, and the veil lifted from his eyes. He was sitting in a lifeboat, which was crashing through the sea, and huge grey waves were smashing over its bow. 12 bush-bearded men wearing life-jackets of cork pulled on the oars, whilst another grappled with the rudder. "Ben!" a voice called. "What's happening?" The boy turned, and through the drizzle that the breakers threw at them, recognised Nelda at his side. "I'm not sure," he called back. "You there!" bawled the coxswain suddenly, and Ben whipped around, but the man seemed to look straight through them. "Henry Freeman! Pull your weight! Want them folk to die on that schooner?" Nelda held on to Ben and stared ahead as the boat smashed into the towering ice-capped waves. They were making for a ship that had been driven ashore, but the surf was treacherous. "Nelda!" Ben yelled. "What's the name of that ship?" She stared at him for a second, then shielded her eyes from the constant battering spray. "It's called Merchant," she told him. "What does that signify?" Then the boy knew exactly what was going to happen, for he had been told the whole story before. Rowena had sent them back to the lifeboat disaster of 1861, and all but one of these men was going to die. Ben was too terrified to look at them. With the sea-water flattening the oilskin hats against their skulls, and their faces drenched and pinched with cold, the lifeboatmen seemed drowned already. Ben clutched Nelda's frozen hand and waited, with his round eyes defying the smarting spray. Now they, too, were part of this nightmare. The storm-mad sea charged at them. With a terrible crash, 2 waves smashed into one another, and the lifeboat was hurled into the air upon a massive spout of water. This time, 15 souls were cast into the freezing brine, their cries smothered by the tumult. Overwhelmed by the mountainous waves, Ben could not remain afloat. The sleet-covered sea filled his mouth and poured into his ears. Swiftly he sank beneath the surface, and his frantic thrashings grew weaker, until he moved no more. "Ben!" spluttered Nelda. "Ben!" But soon her voice too was drowned. Jennet fell onto the cool turf, and rubbed her head as she looked around her. The abbey reared up behind as she was standing near the edge of the cliff, but there was no sign of her brother. Whitby was sleeping peacefully below, but something was not quite right. Where were the hospital and amusement arcades? With a shock she realized she was looking on some bygone time before she was even born. Turning, she gazed out to sea and saw two dark shapes upon the water. They appeared almost like battleships. A small explosion burst from one of the sinister vessels. Overhead, something whistled through the darkness, and suddenly the cliff-top was ablaze with flame. She had been dragged back to the time of the First World War, when two German ships had fired upon Whitby. The air seemed violently alive as the bombarding shells exploded around her, and Jennet crawled over the ground in an attempt to get under cover. As she passed under the tall arches of the abbey, with a deafening blast, one of the mortars struck the west wall, and the stones flew apart. The place Jennet had chosen to shelter behind was blown out of existence. Shrieks of death stabbed into the gloom, and a Viking dragon boat rammed onto the beach. Brandishing fiery torches, the raiders jumped ashore, spears and swords flashing in their hands. Panic and fear filled the air. Out of the small buildings, women and children poured. "To the abbey!" they called to one another. On the slope of the cliff, Miss Boston and Hesper slithered in the soft clay. Harsh war cries resounded in their ears, and they looked fearfully on the burning settlement below. "We must not linger here," Hesper said urgently. "Listen to those screams. They are the sounds of death." Up on the cliff-top, Hesper saw the Anglo-Saxon abbey, with the smaller monastery buildings clustered round it. This abbey was not as tall as the later one, but a proud and noble structure nonetheless. Hidden in the deep shadows, a solitary figure watched and waited. "Will these folk be safe in here?" Hesper asked Miss Boston. "No. The Norsemen have no respect for the church. They will chase those poor people up here and kill them. Then the abbey will be robbed of its treasures and razed to the ground. I'm afraid we are an extremely barbaric species." "Come!" cried Hesper. "We must run! A spear does not have to see its target to slay it." At that moment the villagers were upon them, and so wildly were they driven by their fear that the frenzied rush of their bodies swept the Aufwader and Miss Boston with them up the cliff. "Hesper!" called Aunt Alice as she tried to drag herself out of the panicking crowd. "Hurry! We must go the other way! Don't let them carry you to the abbey! It's too dangerous there!" Finally, Aunt Alice broke free of the crazed villagers. She scurried and skidded to the right, out of the pursuing invaders' path. Sliding through the mire, she ran for cover. In terror, Hesper saw the Norsemen raging nearer, storming with their axes and saws raised towards the abbey entrance. She was caught in the middle. "Run!" cried Aunt Alice. Hesper hitched up her lifebelt, which had fallen around her ankles, and dodged out of the way just as the fury of the Danes crashed through the doors of the abbey. The oak splintered before them, and they lunged inside. Hesper scampered down the slope to Miss Boston. She was nearly there when a faint noise brought her to a halt. A child's voice was whimpering. She spun round and saw a figure lying face down in the mud. It was a boy about 4 years old. Hesper rushed hastily to the child and turned him over. He groaned and opened a bleary eye. "I know that you cannot hear me," the Aufwader said, "but you must not remain here. Go hide till the danger passes." Stooping low, she slid her hands under his shoulders and hauled him to his feet. The boy stared about him, too awestruck to utter a single word. It was as if the angels were lifting him. An infuriating roar came from the abbey behind, and Hesper whirled round to see a tall, red-haired man draw back his spear, his sight fixed on the escaping child. "No!" Hesper screamed and ran forward. Not caring for her own safety, she darted between the Viking and the boy. The spear hurtled from the Viking's grasp and plunged into the Aufwader's chest, throwing her down. The Dane spat on the floor with disgust. That was a bad spear. It did not fly straight and true, so let it rot in the ground where it had fallen. Miss Boston stumbled over to the wounded Aufwader. The weapon had gone right through her and was embedded in the soil beneath. The old lady knelt beside her in the reddening mud and gently lifted her head. "Did the child get away?" Hesper asked. Miss Boston nodded, the tears trickling down her wrinkled face. "Good. It is fitting that I gave my life for one so young," Hesper whispered. "Weep not for me. My troubles are ended. Save your sorrow for your own kind." Her voice grew weaker, and her features twisted in agony. The Aufwader closed her eyes and died in Miss Boston's arms. "Don't waste your grief on that," sneered Rowena contemptuously. Aunt Alice glared up at her. Never had she been moved to such anger and outrage. She sprang and rushed at the witch, lashing out in spite of her fears. So fierce and unexpected was the attack that it took Rowena utterly by surprise. The old lady made a grab at the staff, but the witch recovered quickly. She bristled with wrath, and a vicious growl rumbled in her throat. Savagely she leapt up and thrust Miss Boston aside. Aunt Alice was too old for physical combat, and she scolded herself crossly. "What do you think you're doing, wrestling at your age, Alice?" she wheezed. "Your body's clapped out, so use your brains." "Hag!" screeched Rowena. "One command from me, and you will suffer untold torments." "Oh, I do beg your pardon," Miss Boston rallied. "I thought you'd already tried that." Sable lightning flashed from the staff, and Rowena shrieked with fury. "You haven't seen 1,000th of my power," she snapped. "The staff obeys no one now," scoffed Aunt Alice. "It was made for Hilda alone to wield, but even she became afraid to use it. That is why she had to hide the thing. It started to take over." Rowena's confidence was not shaken. "Don't be absurd," she laughed. "I am in full control. Hilda was weak. She listened too long to the whines of the bishops and abandoned the way of the knight. That is all." "Use your head, woman," Aunt Alice said. "If that were true, then Hilda would have had the staff destroyed. The staff is invulnerable. It cannot be broken. It is using you. It needs a human vessel to work through, and you shall be utterly enslaved." The witch rounded on her. "Name a time," she demanded. "Name a year, a day, if you wish, and you shall see who rules here. Come on, hag! Choose!" Miss Boston stammered and shuffled backwards. Let me see. Any time, did you say?" She counted on her fingers and scratched her woolly head idiotically. 19, no, 6, dear me, no, of course not, June 25th, 1830, she said at last. "My grandpa's birthday, don't you know?" Rowena threw back her head and held the staff high in the air. "Hear me," she announced. "Show your devotion. Acknowledge my sovereignty." At once the wind died down. The sun slowed and came to rest in the bright blue sky of a hot June afternoon. The hazy images of Whitby slowed down and fused into a solid collection of houses. Then, with the end of the staff, Rowena tapped the ground 3 times and closed her eyes. "From the very jaws of death I snatch thee," she muttered. A blaze of purple fire burst over the grass, and out of Whitby's history crashed 3 figures. Ben and Nelda gasped for breath. They were soaked to the skin, and icy seawater dripped from them onto the summer grass. Jennet crouched nearby with her fingers in her ears and her eyes squeezed shut. Miss Boston was overjoyed. She longed to run to them, but her difficult task was not yet finished. Her eyes rolled cautiously up as she turned back to Rowena. "A good 4 or 5 meters to go yet," she told herself quietly. The witch was glowing with satisfaction as she smugly gazed at the tranquil scene around them. "See how wrong you were," she breathed. "I have total command over absolutely everything." "Yes," Aunt Alice mumbled. "I rather think you have." The old lady wrung her hands and in a small, frightened voice asked, "Rowena, what will you do with me now? Have mercy, I beg you." Very slowly she started to shuffle away through the high archway below the central tower. Rowena's hellish laughter rang round the abbey ruins as she summoned all her black powers, and the ancient stones shook around her. "Only now! Do you understand?" she howled. "Look at me and die!" Her face was pulled into a dreadful snarl, and the hackles prickled from her neck. The fingers which held the staff twisted into claws, and in a deep, rumbling voice she roared, "Your life is over! I'm going to rip you apart!" With her jaws slavering, the witch sprang at Miss Boston. But the old lady was not as cowed as she pretended to be. She stepped nimbly aside, and, as the terrible creature lunged, she gave it a mighty stab with her hatpin. Rowena howled and yammered, but then she turned again on her prey. Miss Boston looked hurriedly at the vaulted ceiling above. Why was it taking so long? Rowena prowled towards her, half woman, half hound. A stone rattled down and bounced over the ground by her feet, but the witch ignored it. As the fiery eyes blazed malevolently at her, Miss Boston bellowed, "I've waited long to do this!" and punched the witch for all she was worth. The blow had little effect, but that little was enough. Rowena stared at her, not believing the audacity of it. Seizing her one chance, the old lady bolted for the archway. From the structure above there came an ominous crack. The great arches were splitting. Rowena looked up warily, and her burning eyes widened with shock as she realized she had been tricked. In a thundering crash, the great central tower collapsed. A shrill howl pierced the deafening tumult as Rowena Cooper was crushed beneath the tons of falling masonry that toppled and smashed down. Beyond the vast pile of broken stones, the children and Nelda were standing with fearful looks on their faces. Where was Aunt Alice? Jennet and Ben rushed forward, calling her name. "What do you think you are doing?" came a voice. Miss Boston's head popped up from behind a wall, and she peered at the devastation. "I thought you were dead," the boy cried. "Quickly," Miss Boston told them. "We must search through this rubble and find the staff of Hilda. It is our only link with the future. If we don't find it, then we may be stuck in this time for good." Jennet dragged a huge square stone from the pile and sent it rolling onto the dusty grass. "Aunt Alice!" she shouted excitedly. "I think I found it! Look!" She staggered down the side of the heap and stared horrified into the hole. The staff was in the grip of a large black paw. "But that's the hound!" stammered Jennet. "Where's Rowena? What happened to her?" "You're looking at her, dear," Aunt Alice answered mildly. "That was Rowena's true nature." She patted Jennet's arm and stooped down to retrieve the staff herself. The staff came free in her hands, and reverently she held it up. She held the staff before her, but a call from Ben interrupted her concentration. "Look up there!" he cried. In the east windows of the abbey, a white light shone. At first they thought it was only an illusion, but then the blurred shape took form, and the old lady gasped in wonder. "My word," murmured Miss Boston, and humbly bowed her head. Jennet shielded her eyes, but found that she could look into the light quite easily without it hurting. The girl blinked. For a second she thought she had seen the figure of a woman. Miss Boston lifted the staff and offered it to the dazzling vision. "Take it," she said respectfully. "It is too dangerous a thing for this world." Briefly the light welled up, and then was extinguished. Jennet gawped stupidly. Everywhere seemed dull and chill. Aunt Alice lowered her hands, which were empty. The staff had gone back to its rightful owner. "All is as it should be," she sighed. "Thank the Lord." "But how shall we get home without it?" asked Ben. The old lady chuckled. "Look about you, dear," she said. It was a grey September dawn, and the town was just waking. Cars lumbered down Church Street, and the fish market was about to start on the West Cliff. Just another ordinary day in Whitby. Miss Boston wrapped her muddy cloak round the two children, and they wandered slowly out of the abbey grounds. Wearily the three of them passed through the churchyard, and on the 199 steps they found Nelda. The body of her aunt was in her arms, and she huddled close, brushing the sand-coloured hair from Hesper's peaceful face. "What will the fisher folk do now?" asked Jennet. Miss Boston shrugged. "I'm afraid there is no hope for them," she replied sorrowfully. "They are doomed to extinction. Now then, let's get you two tucked into bed." Ben trailed behind them silently. He knew that one day he would have to atone for his failure to lift the curse of the deep ones. And that's the end of the first in the Whitby series.